Chapter 20. New mackerel, 6 a shilling. Sebastian pushed his way through the ragged crowd of rough men, desperate-looking women, and sharp-faced, grimy urchins, clogging the narrow lane known as Houndsditch. The decaying, centuries-old buildings rising from the pavement cast the lane in deep shadow, their upper stories leaning precariously toward one another until it seemed they might almost touch overhead. Wild Hampshire rabbits, 2 a shilling. Buy my trap, my rat trap. Once, Houndsditch had been nothing more than a defensive trench dug along the western edge of London's city walls. Running south-east from Bishopsgate to Aldgate, it eventually grew so foul with refuse and offal and the bloated carcasses of dead dogs that city officials ordered it filled in. Never a fashionable area, it was occupied today mainly by immigrants and their descendants, particularly Huguenots from France, Jews from the Netherlands, Germany and Poland, and increasingly the Irish. The poverty of the residents made it a centre for rag fairs and second-hand shops. Crude stalls piled with everything from battered tin saucepans and worn-out boots to cheap tallow candles lined the street, while bellowing vendors dispensed hot tea from cans and guarded piles of sliced bread and butter from the hordes of ragged, starving children. The air was thick with the smells of herring, smoke, effluvia, and despair. Press Mulligan's establishment stood on the corner of Houndsditch and a dark, narrow alley that curled toward Devonshire Square. Only 2 stories tall, with filthy, small-paned windows and sagging lintels, the structure looked to be in the final stages of dilapidation, its walls so darkened by grime as to appear almost black. Sebastian had to lean hard against the battered, warped door. A small brass bell jangled as it swung open. He'd been expecting something similar to Basil Thistlewood's eclectic collection of rare treasures mixed indiscriminately with the curious or merely odd. But this was more like a thieves' den from a child's fable, with exquisitely painted porcelain vases, snuff-boxes with intricate filigreed lids, willowy Chinese maidens carved from ivory, gilded saints' images, even a life-sized winged horse of glistening white marble. He turned in a slow circle, trying to take it all in. When he came back around, he found himself being studied by a pair of beady black eyes. "Who might you be, then?" demanded Pris Mulligan. She couldn't have stood more than 4'10", and was nearly as broad as she was tall, with thick dark hair and creamy white skin, and puffy round arms that ended in incredibly small childlike hands. "A potential customer?" Sebastian suggested. She gave a disbelieving grunt. "'Tis possible, I'm supposing, but is it likely?" She pursed her lips and shot a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby can. "Nah." In age, she could have been anywhere between 35 and 50, her massive hips churning beneath her high-waisted brown bombazine gown as she came forward, her gaze never leaving his face. "You ain't a beak, that I can tell, just looking at you." "No," agreed Sebastian. She sniffed and wiped her lips with the back of one hand. Sebastian said, "I understand you recently sold a Spanish reliquary to a friend of mine." "Oh? And who might your friend be?" "Stanley Preston. Him has just got his head cut off." "So you did know him?" "Sure. Then but any fool on the street will recognise that name. Ain't often a body gets his head lopped off in London. Leastways, not these days." "You didn't sell him a reliquary?" Sebastian nodded to a gilded bronze receptacle moulded in the shape of an arm, presumably because that's what it contained. "Rather like that, except a foot." "Came out of a church in Italy, that one did." "How did it end up here?" "Emigre sold it to me just last week. Always coming in here, they are, looking to unload all manner of things. Need the money, you see." Sebastian caught the faint sound of a man's hushed breathing coming from behind the curtained doorway at the rear of the shop. Someone was there, watching and listening. He kept his gaze fixed on the woman before him. "Seems a curious item to pack when you're fleeing for your life," he said. Pris Mulligan's lips pulled back in a smile that showed small, sharp teeth stained brown by tobacco. "Some people have no sense." "When was the last time you saw Mr. Preston?" "Didn't say I had seen him, me." Sebastian studied the woman's plump, creamy face and small, still faintly smiling mouth. Like most people who made their livings by buying and selling, she was shrewd and crafty, and doubtless far from honest. But there was something else about her, something that went beyond mere venality. She was a woman whom even cocksure young boys would cross the street to avoid, whose presence made horses snort nervously, and dogs slink, bellies to the ground. The degree of malevolence in her was palpable. She was looking at him with narrowed eyes. "Have I seen you before?" "Not to my knowledge." She smiled wider and pointed one fat, stubby finger at him. "I know what it is. You look more'n a bit like that rifleman keeps a tavern just off Bishopsgate. Got those same nasty yellow eyes, he does." "Interesting," said Sebastian, careful to keep his voice bland, almost bored, although in truth he was fully aware of the existence of a Bishopsgate tavern-keeper who looked enough like him to be his brother, or at least a half-brother. "You essentially have two choices. You can either answer my questions, or I can suggest to Bow Street that an inspection of your premises might yield some interesting results." Her breath was coming fast now, in angry little pants. "Folks around here'll tell you it ain't a good idea to mess with Pris Mulligan." "So I've heard." Sebastian let his gaze drift around the crowded shop. "I don't see any human heads." "Only heads I ever sell are saints' heads covered with silver or gilt bronze, like that arm there." "When was the last time you saw Stanley Preston?" "Never said I did. Never said I didn't." "So when was it?" Her smile shifted subtly, became something reflecting true humour, although the source of her amusement escaped him. "A month or more ago it was, to be sure." "Who do you think killed him?" "Someone who wanted him dead, I expect." "Know anyone who falls into that category?" "Not so's I can think of offhand." "You had no disagreements with him?" Her eyes widened with a practised intensity and semblance of earnest honesty that almost, but not quite, struck him as comical. "I did not," she said. "How often would he buy from you?" "Now and then." "Did he ever put in a request for anything special?" "On occasion." "Such as?" "Oh, this and that." The breathing from the far side of the curtain grew harsher, faster. Sebastian said, "Must be something of a disappointment to lose one of your best customers." Pris Mulligan worked the wad of tobacco in her jaw. "I got others." He touched his hand to his hat. "Thank you for your help." "Any time, your lordship. Any time." He didn't bother to ask how she knew he was a lord. The truth was, asking any question of the Irishwoman was unlikely to elicit either a direct or an honest response. People like Pris Mulligan lived their lives behind a miasma of subterfuge and deliberately generated fear. It said something about Stanley Preston that he had done business with the woman. Repeatedly. Sebastian walked out of the shop into the ragged crush of Houndsditch's overcrowded, desperately poor residents. The light was beginning to fade from the sky. Whatever warmth there might once have been was gone from the day. As he turned toward Bishopsgate, where he'd left Tom with the curricle, he was aware of a nondescript, slope-shouldered man slipping from the noisome alley alongside the shop, to fall into step behind him. Chapter 21. With the approach of evening, a fierce bank of clouds had scuttled in from the east, their roiling dark underbellies tinged with a strange coppery-green glow. Billowing gusts of wind sent handbills fluttering over the uneven paving stones and flapped the worn black shawl of a stooped old woman hawking nuts from a rusty tray. The knots of dirty, pinch-faced children huddled closer to the braziers of the coffee stalls and hot potato sellers, their hollow eyes following Sebastian without curiosity or comprehension as he passed. He paused, as if to study the colourful caricatures displayed in a print shop's dusty window, being careful not to glance toward the slope-shouldered man in polished black boots, who drew up abruptly and started fumbling in his pockets as if in search of a handkerchief. When Sebastian walked on, the click-click of the man's boot heels was just audible above the din of rattling cartwheels and the shouts of the children and the sing-song cries of the street sellers. Sebastian quickened his pace and heard that distinctive click-click speed up. When he slowed, so did his shadow. Then, as they neared the end of the lane, Sebastian turned abruptly and strode back toward Pris Mulligan's shop. The slope-shouldered man paused, his eyes widening ever so subtly. Of medium height and lanky, despite his small pot belly, he had stringy black hair worn long enough to hang over his collar, and a noticeably asymmetrical face with a bulbous nose and crooked mouth. But he was obviously convinced that Sebastian remained oblivious to him, because he simply turned as if to watch a brewer's wagon full of empty casks that was rattling up the street, its tired horses hanging their shaggy heads, the malty aroma of ale mingling with the smell of roasted nuts and hot coffee and dung. "Who are you?" demanded Sebastian, walking right up to him. "And why the devil are you following me?" He expected the man to run, or at least to deny following him. Instead, the man laughed, his face instantly transforming from bland abstraction into a mask of glee. "I'd heard you were good," he said, "but I didn't credit it myself." "Your mistake, ain't it just?" Sebastian studied the man's beard-shadowed face, the grimy collar and filthy hair. His clothes were those of a workman down on his luck, or someone who had other reasons for doing his shopping at the rag fairs of Rosemary Lane. "Who are you?" said Sebastian again. The man tipped his hat and bobbed his head as if making an introduction. "Name's Flynn. Diggory Flynn." "Why were you following me?" Diggory Flynn's eyes slid away, his tongue licking out to wet his full, oddly misshapen lips. "Didn't mean you no harm." "And why should I believe you?" "Never did you nothing now, did I?" "Maybe, maybe not. Someone took a shot at me just last night. Could have been you. I don't know nothing about that." "Who set you after me?" "What makes you think anybody did?" "Who told you I'm good?" A strange quiver passed over the man's lopsided face, then was gone. "You've got a reputation, you do." Sebastian resisted the urge to grab the man by the front of his coat and shove him up against the dirty brick wall of the wretched shop beside them. "Why were you following me?" "You got some folks worried, you do." "Who?" The man had the strangest eyes, one a pale blue that burned with a fierce intensity as if lit from within by a fire bordering on madness. The other was light brown. "You think on it. You'll know." "Where did you get the boots?" "The boots?" He cast an admiring glance down at them. "Won 'em off a hussar captain, I did. Ain't they grand?" "I knew exploring officers in the army who had no trouble rubbing grease in their hair or dressing themselves in filthy rags, but for some reason they really, really hated wearing anything but their own boots. It got them killed sometimes." Diggory Flynn's face shone with merriment, but all he said was, "I wouldn't know nothing about that. Weren't ever in the army myself." Sebastian took a step back, then another, his gaze never leaving Flynn's face. "Turn around and walk back the way you came." "What?" "You heard me." Flynn touched a hand to his battered slouch hat. "Yes, sir," he said, his grin never slipping. Then he thrust his hands in the sagging pockets of his worn-out coat and sauntered back up the lane, whistling bonny light horseman, softly beneath his breath. "I assume this Diggory Flynn is the man you heard behind the curtain in Pris Mulligan's shop," said Hero. She was seated in the armchair beside the bedroom fireplace, one hand trailing lightly over the back of the big, long-haired black cat stretched out beside her. The cat had adopted them some months before, although they'd yet to come up with a name that seemed right for him. It was nearly midnight. The fire on the hearth filled the room with a warm golden glow, while outside a howling wind buffeted the house and sent the rain clattering against the window panes. "It's possible," said Sebastian, holding his dozing son against his shoulder, his palm splayed against the child's tiny body as he walked back and forth. "Yet you don't sound convinced. Why?" He found himself reluctant to put his suspicions into words. "She certainly has a nasty reputation, and I suspect it's well earned." "It's odd, but he sounds rather like the man I saw at Covent Garden Market this morning." Sebastian turned to look at her. "What man in Covent Garden?" "I thought I told you about him. It was my Costa guide, Lucky Gordon, who noticed him first. He was simply standing there, staring at me, but when I tried to approach and ask what he wanted, he disappeared." Sebastian went to lay the sleeping babe in his cradle, then stood for a moment watching the firelight dance over the child's soft cheeks and the gentle curve of his dusky lashes. And he knew it again, that chilling whisper of fear, that shuddering awareness of how fragile and vulnerable were the lives of those he loved. "What?" asked Hero, watching him. "As of dawn this morning, I had never heard of Pris Mulligan, so why would she have set someone to follow my wife?" "Why would anyone?" When he remained silent, she said, "You think Diggory Flynn works for Oliphant, don't you?" "Yes." She tilted her head to one side, and he knew what she was thinking, that his history with Oliphant was tempting him to see connections where they didn't necessarily exist. He acknowledged that she might even be right. But he didn't think so. She said, "Why would Oliphant set someone to watch me? Not you, but me." Sebastian went to where a decanter stood warming on a table before the fire, and poured himself a glass of brandy. "It's a game he plays, a game of intimidation. He wants people to know they're being watched, and that the people they love are vulnerable. He enjoys making them afraid." "I would think he'd know you better than that. Know that you don't frighten easily." He watched her head bend as she stroked the cat, watched the firelight catch the subtle auburn glints in the heavy fall of her hair, and glaze the angle of her cheekbone. He wanted to tell her that there were things Oliphant knew that she did not, and that sometimes the innocent are made to pay for the sins of the guilty. But all he said was, "The thought of anything happening to you or Simon scares the hell out of me." She lifted her head to meet his gaze, her features calm and still. "Nothing is going to happen to us." He took a long pull of his brandy and felt it burn deep in his chest. "Your father thinks I'm putting you at risk simply by looking into Preston's murder." "Well, that's something you two have in common, then. Needlessly worrying about Simon and me, I mean." She shifted her hand to scratch the cat beneath his chin, the feline's eyes slitting with pleasure as he lifted his head. "Jarvis tells me Charles I's head is missing, as well as the coffin strap." Sebastian went to stand before the fire. "Saw him, did you?" "This afternoon, when Simon and I were visiting my mother. He is not exactly pleased with you, is he?" "Is he ever?" A gleam of amusement showed in the grey eyes that was so much like her father's. "No." The amusement faded. "Do you have any idea yet how the theft from the Royal Vault figures into Preston's murder?" "Oh, I've plenty of ideas, and not a bloody clue which, if any, of them are right. I don't even know who brought the coffin strap to the bridge that night. It could have been the original thief, or a dealer, or the killer, assuming that the thief or dealer isn't the killer, or even Preston himself. Why would Preston be carrying it? Sebastian shrugged. Perhaps he was taking it to show someone, or perhaps he just purchased it. He tilted his head back and moved it slowly from side to side in a futile attempt to loosen some of the tension he carried in his neck. If the strap had been left beside the body, I might think the killer intended it as some sort of statement or warning. But it wasn't. It was lying in weeds down near the creek, as if someone had simply dropped it. Perhaps the killer did leave it with the body. Only someone else came along and picked it up. Someone who then dropped it in fright. Or perhaps the killer was stealing it and he dropped it. I can see Thistlewood or Pris Mulligan taking the coffin strap, but not Oliphant or Wyeth. She smiled. You complained last night that you had almost no suspects. Now you have almost too many. The unknown relic thief, a vindictive ex-governor, a scorned army captain, a rival curiosity collector, and a nasty second-hand dealer. Don't forget the banker who quarrelled with Preston right before he was killed. I haven't even been able to speak with him yet. What's his name? Do you know? Sebastian nodded. Henry Austen. I spoke to his sister. You mean Jane Austen? Yes. You know her. I met her a few times at a friend's salon last year. She's a deceptively clever woman with a devastating wit. She is indeed. She tells me Preston was angry with her brother over something Austen's wife said. Sounds like a rather silly argument over which to kill someone. True. Yet men have killed for less. And he is the last person known to have seen Preston alive. Sebastian drained his glass and set it aside. Then his gaze fell on the set of 3 slim blue volumes that rested on the table beside her chair, and he said, Don't tell me you're reading this new anonymous novel as well. My mother gave it to me. It's quite entertaining. She scooped the cat up into her arms and laughed out loud when he stiffened and widened his eyes in indignation. And I found the perfect name for you, she told the cat. It precisely captures your charming blend of arrogance and aloofness, and your impressive handsomeness, of course. Oh, what's that? Mr. Darcy. Sebastian shook his head. I don't understand. She let the cat go and smiled as he jumped down in disgust. Then you must read the book. Chapter 22. Wednesday, 24th of March. The next morning, Sebastian was standing on the corner of Henrietta Street, his gaze drifting over the facade of Henry Austen's bank, when a tall, slim man in a neatly tailored blue coat and high-crowned beaver hat emerged from the bank's entrance and walked across the street toward him. He looked to be in his early 40s, with a long face, an aristocratic nose, and a military carriage that lingered still. His small, thin mouth curled up in a pleasant smile that was probably habitual, and he looked enough like his sister that Sebastian had no difficulty identifying him. I thought I'd save my clerk the trauma of another visit from you and simply come out, said Henry Austen, drawing up before him. Was he traumatized? Asked Sebastian, as the 2 men turned to walk along Bedford Street toward the Strand and Fleet Street. He likes to pretend he is, at any rate. Austen threw him a swift sideways glance. My sister warned me to expect a visit from either you or Bow Street. Am I a suspect? Bow Street thinks you are. Austen pressed his lips together and drew in a deep breath that flared his nostrils. It's because of that blasted incident in the pub the other night, is it? Is there another reason Bow Street should suspect you? Good God, no. They paused at a side street to allow a collier's wagon to lumber past. Why precisely did you quarrel? Sebastian asked. He'd already listened to Jane Austen's explanation, but he wanted to hear her brother's version. "I don't know if I'd describe it as a quarrel exactly. Preston was already furious when he walked into the pub. If you ask me, he was looking for someone on whom to unload some spleen, and I was simply there." "What was he angry about?" "The crushing of his grand ambition of seeing his daughter married to a title, I suppose. Jane told you about Anne, didn't she?" "She did. Although I must admit I find it hard to believe Preston would be so enraged simply because your wife expressed regrets over something she said 6 years ago." "Yes. Well—" Austen put up a hand to scratch his ear. "The thing is, I didn't exactly tell my sister everything. I mean, Preston was angry because of what Eliza had said, but he was also furious with Jane." "For what?" "For encouraging Anne's romantic notions, was the way he put it. You see, before Captain Wyeth reappeared in town, Anne was on the verge of accepting an offer from Sir Galen Knightley." Sebastian was familiar with Sir Galen. A prosperous, if somewhat lacklustre baronet, he was 10 years older than Sebastian, which would make him nearly 20 years older than Anne Preston. "And your sister discouraged the match?" "Oh, no. At least, not intentionally. It's just that Anne likes to read romance novels." "And Miss Austen gave her the novels?" The banker drew his chin back into his cravat and fiddled self-consciously with the buttons of his coat. "Well, yes." Sebastian watched Austen's gaze slide away. The man obviously needed to take lessons in lying from someone with Pris Mulligan's talents. Although why he should be anything less than honest about his sister's involvement in Anne Preston's reading material escaped Sebastian entirely. Sebastian said, "How well did you know Preston?" "I've known him for years, although the real friendship was between our wives." "Any idea what he might have been doing at Bloody Bridge on a rainy Sunday night?" "I suppose it's possible he decided to go for a walk after leaving the pub. He'd worked himself up into quite a rage. Perhaps he realized he needed to cool off." "I understand he had something of a temper." "He did, yes. Although I've known worse. Much worse, actually. He was a man of strong passions, who sometimes allowed his emotions to override his sense. But there was no real harm in him." There was no real harm in him. Austen's words almost exactly echoed those of his sister, and Sebastian found himself wondering why both Austens had felt compelled to make such similar observations. He said, "Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to kill him?" "No. But then, as I said, we weren't exactly intimates." "Did you ever hear him mention a man named Oliphant?" "Who?" "Sinclair, Lord Oliphant. He was until recently the governor of Jamaica." Austen thought about it, but shook his head. "Sorry. You might try talking to Sir Galen Knightley. He owns plantations in Jamaica too, you know. And unlike Preston, he's quite a steady fellow. My sister Jane calls him Colonel Brandon." "Colonel Brandon? Why?" Austen glanced down, his eyes crinkling as if at a private joke. "I suppose you've never read Sense and Sensibility?" "By the author of this new novel everyone is talking about?" "No." "Ah, well, there's a character in it, Colonel Brandon, a staid older man in love with a much younger woman who herself prefers a younger, more romantic figure." "And Sir Galen Knightley reminds your sister of this character?" "He does, yes. I don't think Sir Galen was ever dashing, even when young." "Unlike Captain Wyeth." The amusement faded from Austen's face, leaving him looking serious and troubled. "Jane worries that Wyeth may well be another Willoughby or Wickham." "Excuse me," said Sebastian. "The dastardly fellows in Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice." "She thinks Wyeth is dastardly?" "Not exactly. It's more that she worries he could be. Have you met him? He's quite handsome and charming. I didn't realize such attributes were considered a bad thing. Austen gave a soft laugh. Jane would tell you that handsome, charming young men without fortune should always be considered suspect, particularly when showering attentions on fair maidens of good family. I'm told Miss Preston is not well dowered. I suppose that depends on your standards. She's no great heiress, certainly, but she has a small portion from her mother, in addition to what she'll get from Preston. I was under the impression Preston had entailed his estate to the male line. He did, yes, but I believe Anne stands to inherit some £5,000 invested in the funds. Now that Preston is dead, said Sebastian. Austen drew up and swung to face him. Surely you don't think Wyeth— He broke off, as if unwilling to put the suggestion into words. Sebastian paused beside him. If not Wyeth, then who? Who do you think killed Preston? Austen shook his head. I would hope I don't number amongst my acquaintances anyone capable of such barbarity. Yet Preston obviously did, whether he realized it or not. Austen puffed out his cheeks as he exhaled a long breath. You're right, of course, although I must admit it's troubling even to think about. He looked out over the wide grey expanse of the river, cut by the newly constructed arches of what would eventually be the Strand Bridge. Try talking to Sir Galen. They'd been friends since Knightley was a lad. He'd be far more likely to know if the man had recently acquired a dangerous enemy. You'll find him in his club's reading room this time of day. Which club? White's, of course. He's there every day from 4 until 5. And he dines at Stephen's every Wednesday and Sunday at 6:30. He's quite the creature of habit. Sebastian studied the banker's long, scholarly face. That gentle, good-humoured smile was firmly back in place. Yet there was an evasiveness, a lack of directness to his gaze that was hard to miss. And Sebastian couldn't escape the feeling that, like his sister, Henry Austen was hiding something. He thanked the banker and started to turn away, only to pause and say, Was Preston carrying anything when he came into the pub that night? Austen looked puzzled. Such as what? A strip of thin old lead about 18 inches long, or perhaps a larger wrapped package or satchel of some kind. Austen thought about it a moment, then shook his head. No. He couldn't have been. You're certain? Yes. I remember quite clearly. He came in with his arms held stiffly at his sides and his fists clenched. He couldn't have been carrying anything. Chapter 23. Sir Galen Knightley was seated in one of the red bucket chairs in White's reading room when Sebastian walked up to him. A cup of tea rested on the table beside him, and he was engrossed in his newspaper's account of the previous evening's session at the House of Lords. Sebastian doubted anyone had ever described Sir Galen as dashing or even handsome, but he was not an unattractive man, despite his angular, somewhat blade-like features. Although he was now in his early 40s, his frame was still strong and solid, his dark hair a little touched by grey. His clothes were those of a prosperous country gentleman, tailored for comfort rather than style, as sober and serious as the man himself. According to gossip, Knightley's father had been a notorious rake, a member of the infamous Hellfire Club, well known about London for his drunken excesses and addiction to deep play. It often seemed to Sebastian that Sir Galen lived his life as if determined to prove to the world that his character was not that of his scandalous father. Where the father had been profligate and intemperate, boisterous and careless, the son was steady, sober, and serious. Eschewing gaming hells, the track, and London's ruinously expensive high flyers, he devoted himself to scholarship and the careful management of his estates in both Hertfordshire and Jamaica. He had married once when young, but his wife died in childbirth, leaving him heartbroken and, if possible, more serious than ever. At Sebastian's approach he looked up, his features set in grave lines. "Do you mind?" asked Sebastian, indicating the nearby chair. "No, not at all." Sir Galen folded his newspaper and set it aside. "I take it you're here about Preston." Sebastian settled into the chair and ordered a glass of Burgundy. "I'm told you knew him well." "I did, yes. His largest plantation in Jamaica lies between the land I inherited from my great-uncle and that of my mother's family." "Have you spent much time there? In Jamaica, I mean?" Sir Galen reached for his tea and took a small sip. "I have, yes. After the death of my grandfather, I was sent to the island to live with my uncle. I find I miss it if I'm away from it too long." Something of Sebastian's thoughts must have shown on his face, because Sir Galen said, "I'm told you're a rather outspoken abolitionist." "Yes." Sir Galen stared down at the delicately patterned china cup in his hands, then set it aside. "It's a dreadful institution. I don't care what the Bible says. I can't believe we were meant to own our fellow beings as if they were nothing more than cattle and horses." "Yet you do." "I do, yes, by the hundreds. I inherited them the same way I inherited Knightley Hall in Hertfordshire, and the money my grandfather invested in the funds. I suppose I could sell them, but while that might soothe my conscience, it wouldn't do anything to improve their situation now, would it? At least, while they're under my care, I can see they're treated well." "You could always free them, and so I would, if I could. But the law requires me to post bond guaranteeing their support for the rest of their lives. All 500 of them. It would bankrupt me. If I were a better man, I suppose I'd do it anyway, but—" He shrugged and shook his head. Sebastian studied the baronet's sun-darkened, broad-featured face. Sebastian had heard of a woman who, upon inheriting an estate in the West Indies, loaded all of the plantation slaves on a ship and transported them to Philadelphia, where she was able to set them free without posting a bond. But all he said was, "Did Preston feel the same way?" "Stanley? Good God, no. He was convinced slavery was instituted by God to enable the superior European race to care for and shepherd the benighted souls of Africa. He genuinely believed that manumission was a misguided evil and contrary to God's plan." "How often did he visit Jamaica?" "He used to go out there quite regularly, but since his son James has taken over the management of the plantations, he's been more content to adopt the role of an absentee landlord." "What can you tell me about his dealings with Governor Oliphant?" "Oliphant?" Knightley pressed his lips together in disgust, as if the name tasted foul on his tongue. "He was extraordinarily unpopular with the planters, you know. Governors frequently are, but let's just say that Oliphant went far beyond what was proper." "Care to elaborate?" "Not really. Anything I could say would be all speculation and hearsay, and I have a healthy respect for England's slander laws, and no desire to fall afoul of them." "Could Preston have had something to do with Oliphant's rather sudden, unexpected return to London?" "We never boasted of it, if that's what you're asking, but—" Sir Galen cast a quick glance around and grimaced suggestively. "Well, his cousin is the Home Secretary now, isn't he?" "Miss Preston tells me her father was afraid of Oliphant." "I've heard he has a reputation for being someone you don't want to cross." Unfortunately, Stanley Preston wasn't the kind of man to let that stop him. Knightley shook his head. He was a brilliant man, well-educated and learned in a number of subjects. But he was not always wise. The waiter delivered Sebastian's wine, and he paused to take a deliberate sip before saying, "I understand Preston was also upset because of his daughter." A faint band of colour appeared high on the older man's cheekbones. "I don't know what you mean." "He was disturbed, was he not, by the reappearance in London of a certain hussar captain?" "I take it you mean Wyeth?" "Yes." Sir Galen shifted his gaze to the large gilt-framed battle scene on the far wall. "I'm afraid Anne, Miss Preston, has a generous nature, which, combined with a warm and trusting heart, can sometimes lead her to misjudge those she meets, especially when a friendly manner and a graceful address create the appearance of amiability. You believe Wyeth's amiability to be merely an appearance?" "I fear it may be. But then, as you are doubtless aware, I am not exactly a disinterested party. When she was younger, the difference in our ages seemed insurmountable. It was only recently I'd begun to think perhaps I might have some chance, but then—" He broke off and shifted uncomfortably with all the embarrassment of a painfully reserved man in love with a younger woman who has given her heart to another. "Do you think Preston would have forbidden a match between his daughter and Captain Wyeth?" "He was certainly determined to do all within his power to prevent them from marrying. He had a younger sister, you know, who married an army officer and died a hideous death at the hands of the natives at a fort in the wilds of America." "No, I didn't know that. Yet Anne Preston is of age, is she not?" "She is, yes." "Would she have married without her father's blessing, do you think?" "If she believed his blessing unfairly withheld, I suspect she would, yes." "And would he have disinherited her if she married against his wishes?" "He certainly swore he intended to do so. But would he have actually carried through with the threat?" Knightley tipped his head to one side, then shrugged. "I honestly don't know." Sebastian stared at him. "You're saying Preston threatened to disinherit Anne if she married Captain Wyeth?" "He told me the day before he was killed that he would cut her off without a farthing if she did. But I can't say whether or not he ever threatened Anne herself. He was like that, you know, full of bluster and passion, saying he was going to do things he would later realize were folly, once he calmed down. Men of that nature frequently accumulate enemies. Unfortunately, yes. Can you think of any, apart from Oliphant and Wyeth?" Sir Galen studied his empty teacup, as if lost for a moment in thought. Then he shook his head. "I'm afraid I can't. No. As I said, his passions sometimes ran away with him, leading him into careless or hasty speech better left unsaid. He doubtless alienated more people than he realized. But can I think of anyone else angry enough to kill him and cut off his head? No. Any idea what Stanley Preston might have been doing at Bloody Bridge that night?" "No. I hadn't actually given it much thought, but you're right. It is odd for him to have been there so late, is it not? He didn't often walk at night, only to the pub and back. There was a time, not so long ago, when Bloody Bridge had a well-deserved reputation for violence. I can't imagine him going there alone at night." "Did he say anything to you about some Stuart relics he was considering buying?" Knightley shook his head. "Not that I recall, no. But then I'm afraid I sometimes didn't pay a great deal of attention when Stanley would start prattling on about his collection." Sebastian set aside his wineglass and rose to his feet. "Thank you. You've been very helpful." Sir Galen rose with him and tucked his paper under one arm in an awkward, self-conscious gesture. He was a good man, you know. My uncle died the summer I was 14, when we were in Jamaica. I had already lost my grandfather and my parents long before that. Stanley Preston took me under his wing. I was nothing more than a tiresome adolescent, but he treated me like a grown man. You couldn't ask for a truer, more loyal friend. Whoever killed him— He broke off, as if fearing the intensity of his emotions might lead him into the kind of intemperate speech he'd just credited to Stanley Preston. He pressed his lips together and shook his head, then said, "Whoever killed him left the world a poorer place." Who do you think did it? The question seemed to surprise Knightley. Me? He paused. If it were me, I suppose I would look into Captain Wyeth's movements. A self-deprecating smile touched his lips. But then, as I said, I'm not exactly disinterested in that quarter. It sounds to me as if this Captain Wyeth may well be our man, said Lovejoy, as he and Sebastian stood on the terrace of the vast pile of government offices known as Somerset House, looking out over the sullen grey waters of the Thames. He readily admits he has no alibi for the time of the murder, and given that Preston was opposing the captain's ambitions of marrying Miss Preston, and had promised to disinherit her if she went against his wishes, he also possessed a powerful motive. Just because he had a motive and no alibi doesn't mean he did it, said Sebastian, watching a crane fit into place a large stone on the New Strand Bridge. I'm still not convinced Henry Austen is being entirely honest about his quarrel that night with Preston. It might be worthwhile to send a constable to talk to the monster's regular patrons. One of them may have overheard something interesting. Lovejoy nodded. Good idea. We've recently discovered Preston received a visitor on Sunday morning, by the way, a physician named Sterling, Douglas Sterling. Preston was unwell. Lovejoy shook his head. According to Miss Preston, her father was in the best of health, at least as far as she knows. What does this Dr. Sterling say? Very little, unfortunately. I sent one of my best lads, a Constable Hart, to speak with him. But Sterling claims the visit was medical in nature, and refuses to discuss it further. When Constable Hart tried to press the matter, the good doctor became quite agitated and stormed off. Hart thinks he's hiding something. Interesting. I'll have to have a go at him. Lovejoy cleared his throat. I should perhaps have mentioned this Dr. Sterling is quite aged. How aged? Nearly 80. He's been retired for years. So why was he treating Preston? He claims he saw him as a favour. They were friends. Miss Preston says he's the former colleague of some relative, a cousin of her grandfather, I believe. Sebastian turned to stare at him. Lord Sidmouth's father was a physician, and her grandfather's cousin. Was he? Then perhaps that's the connection. Where does this Dr. Sterling live? Number 14 Chatham Place. But I gather he spends most of his time at a coffee-house near the bridgehead. He sounds like a crusty old gentleman. I suspect you'll not find him easy to coerce into talking, if he's made up his mind not to. Perhaps I can appeal to his better nature. After listening to Constable Hart, said Lovejoy, turning away from the river, I'm not convinced he has one. Chapter 24. Douglas Sterling proved to be one of those aged gentlemen who still clung to the powdered wigs considered de rigueur for men of birth and education when they were in their prime. Sebastian found him in a coffee-house on the east side of Chatham Place, seated near the bowed front window where he could watch the steady stream of traffic passing back and forth on Blackfriars Bridge. He was hunched over a medical journal that lay open on the table before him, but looked up and frowned when Sebastian paused beside him. His face was heavily lined with age, the skin sallow and blotched with liver spots, but his frame was still lean, his hands unpalsied, his dark eyes shiny with a belligerent intelligence. "You're obviously not from Bow Street," he said, his voice raspy but strong. "So what in the blazes do you want with me?" "Mind if I have a seat?" "As a matter of fact, I do," said the old man, and returned pointedly to his reading. Sebastian leaned one shoulder against a nearby wall, his arms crossed at his chest. Through the window he could see a massive farm wagon heavily laden with hay, jolting and swaying as it came down off the bridge's span. "Nice view," he said. "Yes." "Come here often, do you?" "You must know I do, otherwise you wouldn't have found me here now, would you?" "I understand you've retired from the practice of medicine." "Pretty much." "Yet you consulted with Stanley Preston the very day he died?" "I like to keep my hand in now and then." "Now and then?" "Yes." The aged physician gave up all pretense of reading and leaned back in his chair. "Who are you?" "The name's Devlin." Sterling's eyes narrowed. "The Earl of Hendon's son?" "Yes." "I hear you've taken a fancy to solving murders. In my day, gentlemen left that sort of thing to the constables and magistrates." "Like Constable Hart?" Sterling grunted. "The man is beyond impudent." Sebastian studied the old doctor's watery, nearly lashless dark eyes. "He thinks you're hiding something." Rather than become flustered, Sterling simply returned Sebastian's steady gaze and said, "He's welcome to think what he likes." "It doesn't disturb you that someone lopped off Stanley Preston's head less than 12 hours after you saw him?" "Of course it disturbs me, as it would any right-minded gentleman." "Yet you refuse to divulge information which could conceivably lead to the apprehension of his killer." "It is only your assumption, and that of a ridiculous Constable Hart, that I possess any such information." "Are you by chance acquainted with the Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth?" "Knew him before he was breeched, I did, although I doubt he'd acknowledge the likes of me now that he's become so fine. Lord Sidmouth, indeed, and his father no more than a simple physician like me." "You were colleagues?" "We were, although it was years ago now." "Yet you still maintained an acquaintance with Stanley Preston?" "That strike you as odd?" "I suppose not." "Tell me this. Did Preston seem at all anxious when you last saw him?" "Frightened?" "Hardly." "How often would you see him?" "Not often." "Yet he consulted with you over a medical problem his own daughter didn't know he had." "I don't discuss my health with my daughters. Do you?" "I don't have a daughter." "A son?" "Yes." The old physician gave a throaty grunt. "Strapping young man like yourself, bet you think you want sons. Carry on the name, make you proud at Oxford and on the hunting field and all that rot. But mark my words, you get to be my age, it's a daughter you'll be wanting." Outside in the square, the hay wagon had caught a wheel in a rut and shuddered to a halt. Someone shouted as the driver cracked his whip. Sebastian said, "What did you think of Preston's interest in collecting the heads of famous men?" The old physician thrust out his upper lip and shrugged. "Ever see the collection of anatomical specimens amassed by the late John Hunter? They're in the care of the Royal College of Surgeons these days." "Can't say that I have." "Mind you, Hunter's collection was based on anatomical peculiarities rather than whatever fame or infamy the individuals may have managed to acquire in life. But his point was the same." "Was it?" "I'd have said the impetus behind Hunter's collection was education and research." "He liked to think it was. Could even have started out that way. But if you'd ever observed his pride in his specimens, you'd know better." Sebastian studied the aged doctor's sallow, wrinkled face. Can you think of anything that might have taken Stanley Preston to Bloody Bridge last Sunday night? No. Ever hear of a man named Sinclair Oliphant? No, said Sterling again, although this time he blinked, and his gaze skittered away. You're certain of that? Course I'm certain. Sterling snapped and glared defiantly back at Sebastian again, as if determined to stare him down. Who do you think killed Stanley Preston? I've no idea. None? None. Then why your reluctance to discuss your last meeting with him? For one brief moment Sterling's jaw sagged, and Sebastian caught a glimpse of uncertainty and what might even have been fear in the old man's eyes. Then the aged physician clenched his teeth together. My meeting with Stanley Preston last Sunday was private, and I intend for it to remain that way. You can stand there for the rest of the day as far as I'm concerned, but I've told you all you need to know. He hunched a shoulder and returned pointedly to his reading. Telling me what you think I need to know is not the same as telling me all you know, said Sebastian. But Sterling kept his stare fixed on the page before him, the powder from his old-fashioned wig dusting the shoulders of his worn coat. Frustrated, Sebastian went next to the Home Office, where his second attempt to speak to Viscount Sidmouth was no more successful than the first. This time the clerk insisted that his lordship was at Carlton House, in consultation with the regent, and was not expected to return that day. Sebastian studied the clerk's pasty white face. He was a short, gently rounded man with a balding pate and a small puckered mouth that curled up into what looked like a habitual condescending smile. At Carlton House, you say? The smirk deepened. That is correct. You're certain of that? Sebastian could quite clearly hear the Home Secretary in conversation with a fellow cabinet member behind a nearby closed door, but the clerk had no way of knowing that. Of course, I am certain, said the little man with a sniff. It's the oddest thing, but I'm beginning to get the impression the Secretary is deliberately avoiding me. The clerk stared back at Sebastian, pale eyes blinking rapidly. If Sidmouth had been closeted with anyone else, Sebastian would have been tempted to set the supercilious clerk aside and open the door to the Home Secretary's office. But Sebastian recognized the voice of the nobleman, whose low, measured tones alternated with Sidmouth's higher ranges. It was the Earl of Hendon, the man Sebastian had called father until a short time ago. Sebastian nodded to the closed door. When the Secretary finishes his meeting with Lord Hendon, you can tell him that I'll be back. The clerk gave a nervous titter. When? When will you be back? When will he be available? I'm afraid I can't really say. He's busy, very busy. Then I suppose I'll simply need to catch him when he's not busy. The clerk's smile slid into something less confident. What does that mean? But Sebastian simply smiled and walked away, leaving the clerk bleating behind him. But what does that mean? What does it mean? That night, Sebastian donned silk knee-breeches, buckled dress shoes, and a chapeau bras, and took his wife to a ball. The ball was given by Countess Lieven, the Russian ambassador's wife. Her husband had only recently been posted to the court of St. James's, yet the young countess had already managed to make herself one of society's leaders. She was politically astute, totally unscrupulous, breathtakingly snobbish, charismatic, and brilliant. Her invitations were amongst the most sought after in London, and her approval was critical to any young lady making her debut into society. If he's that desperate to avoid you, Hero said to Sebastian as their carriage joined the crush of fashionable vehicles making their way toward the Lievens' townhouse, maybe he won't be there. His daughter is making her come out this season. He'll be there. Chapter 25. Henry Addington, first Viscount Sidmouth, stood at the edge of the crowded dance floor an indulgent smile on his face as he watched his pretty, dark-haired daughter advancing through the movements of an energetic Scottish reel. Overhead, massive crystal chandeliers sparkled in the flickering light of a sea of candles. The air was thick with the smell of hot wax and expensive perfume, and copious perspiration from the laughing, chattering, jewel-bedecked members of the ton. Sidmouth himself was looking more than a little damp. So intent was the Home Secretary on watching his daughter's progress that he remained oblivious to Sebastian's approach, until Sebastian said, "Ah, there you are." Sidmouth gave an uncomfortable start and glanced around as if looking for some place to hide. "I've been wanting to speak to you," said Sebastian. The Home Secretary's jaw sagged, his eyes bulging. "Yes, I know, but here?" "We could step into one of the withdrawing rooms, if you'd prefer. Perhaps you could come by my office tomorrow morning and—" "No," said Sebastian. Sidmouth cleared his throat uncomfortably. "One of the withdrawing rooms, yes." He led the way to a small alcove near the head of the stairs, then swung about to clear his throat and say in a low voice, "I'm told you're working with Bow Street to solve this ghastly murder of my poor cousin." "I am, yes. We weren't close, you know," said Sidmouth. "First cousins once removed." "But you did know him?" "Yes, of course, just not well." "When was the last time you saw him?" The Home Secretary blinked rapidly. "Can't really say, I'm afraid, but it's been weeks. Yes, surely weeks, if not months." "Know anyone who might have wanted to kill him?" Sidmouth looked shocked and vaguely offended by the suggestion. "Good gracious, no." Sebastian studied the other man's long, pale face with its patrician nose and incongruously heavy jaw. "I understand you know an elderly physician named Douglas Sterling." "Sterling?" Sidmouth gave a nervous laugh. "He was an early colleague of my father. What has he to do with anything?" "When did you last see him?" "Good gracious, I've no idea." "Why?" Rather than answer him, Sebastian said, "Tell me about Sinclair Oliphant." Sidmouth's face went slack. "What? Why was he recalled from Jamaica?" The secretary drew back his shoulders and affected a haughty ministerial air. "I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to discuss Home Office affairs." "But he was recalled. The decision to return to England was Lord Oliphant's own." "That's not what I'm hearing." Sidmouth waved one white-gloved hand in a dismissive gesture. "Rumour. Nothing but rumour." "So you're saying your cousin had nothing to do with it?" The Home Secretary's nostrils flared with the intensity of his indignation. "I beg your pardon?" Sebastian met the man's angry gaze and held it. "It has occurred to you, surely, that Oliphant might be responsible for Stanley Preston's head ending up on Bloody Bridge, and that if he is, then you might be his next victim." Sidmouth's eyes went wide, his assumption of ministerial magnificence slipping. "Good God! You aren't seriously suggesting that Oliphant did that to Stanley?" Then he shook his head so vigorously he reminded Sebastian of a man coming in out of the rain. "No, I can't believe it." "But something did happen between the two men?" "I didn't say that." "From what I'm hearing, there were few people with whom Stanley Preston didn't quarrel at one time or another. Yet you would have me believe he never clashed with Oliphant while he was governor?" "Yes, well, disputes between colonial governors and prominent local landowners are unfortunately all too frequent, you know." "And Stanley Preston had the advantage of being first cousin once removed to the Home Secretary." Rather than respond, Sidmouth kept his features composed into a politician's practised mask. "If I were you, I'd be very careful," said Sebastian, glancing significantly to where Sidmouth's daughter was now skipping down the line of dancers on her partner's arm. He started to turn away, but Sidmouth's hand flashed out, stopping him. "Surely you're not suggesting that someone might threaten my daughter?" Sebastian studied the Home Secretary's twitchy, sweat-slicked face. "Look into what happened to the nuns and orphans of Santa Iria, then make up your own mind," he said, and left Sidmouth standing at the entrance to the alcove, his long, normally self-satisfied face now pale and haggard. Hero was sipping a glass of lemonade, her gaze on Devlin's stunningly beautiful young niece, Miss Stephanie Wilcox, when a deep male voice behind her said, "Lady Devlin. It is Lady Devlin, is it not?" She turned to find herself being addressed by a tall, fit-looking man in his 40s, with handsome chiselled features, clear blue eyes, and a wide, even smile. "I hope you'll forgive my boldness in approaching you without an introduction, but I knew your husband in the peninsula." He swept an elegant bow. "I am Oliphant. Sinclair, Colonel Lord Oliphant." Hero felt a hot, tingling sensation in her hands as a surge of primitive rage swept through her. For one blindingly intense moment, all she could think was that if this smiling, urbane man had had his way, Devlin would long ago have been consigned to a lonely, forgotten grave in the mountains of Portugal. "Lord Oliphant," she said, her voice as coldly polite as her smile. "I have heard Devlin speak of you." A gleam of amusement showed in the Colonel's eyes, but all he said was, "You're here without your husband." "Oh, no. Devlin is here." She studied Oliphant's even patrician features, searching for some trace of the brutal, single-minded determination that could deliberately send a subordinate officer into the hands of the enemy and cause the deaths of dozens of innocent women and children. But his mask of good humour and gentle benevolence was firmly in place. He said, "I can't tell you how relieved I was to hear that Devlin has finally settled down and married. The responsibilities of family tend to exert such a, shall we say, steadying influence on our wilder youths." "Some more than others," Hero said dryly. She took a slow sip of her lemonade. "I understand you've only recently returned from Jamaica." "I have, yes. It's a lovely place. Have you ever been?" "Unfortunately, no. I've never visited any of the islands." "Pity. You must try to make it out there sometime. I've no doubt you'll be charmed." He bowed again. "Do give my regards to your husband." And he walked away, leaving her wondering why he had approached her in the first place. She was still staring after him when she became aware of Devlin coming up beside her. She could feel the aura of lethal animosity radiating from him, see the cold, deadly purposefulness in his face. "What did he say?" he asked, his gaze like hers on the retreating figure. Hero shook her head. "Polite nothings. I don't understand why he bothered." "To assess what you know, and to decide how easy you are to intimidate." "Unfortunately, one can't shoot a man in the middle of a ball," said Hero, "particularly not at one of Countess Lieven's balls. It's bad form." Devlin smiled then, a smile that seemed to banish the tortured memories and dark urges provoked by Oliphant's presence. But she knew they weren't really gone, only tucked away out of sight. Out of her sight. She was suddenly unnaturally aware of the roar of well-bred voices and genteel laughter around them, of the crush of bodies clothed in satin and silk, and the gleam of endless tiers of candles reflected in soaring, gilded mirrors. Theirs was a rarefied world of manners and careful calculations, ruled by the dictates of taste and fashion. A world where extremes of emotion were outrés, where all was controlled and measured. An artificial hothouse where everyone pretended that civilization was more than just a thin, brittle veneer, all too easily and frequently shattered. She wanted to say, "We need to talk about this, Devlin. We can't keep shying away from acknowledging and confronting the darkest urges of our souls." She wanted to tell him of her fears and share with him the tumult of feelings she could barely admit even to herself. But as the music ended and new sets began to form for an old-fashioned court dance, what she said was, "When was the last time we danced?" She saw the flicker of surprise in those strange yellow eyes as he turned toward her. He knew she loved to dance, but he also knew she'd been reluctant to come tonight, worried about how Simon would fare without her, and anxious not to stay away too long. "Before Christmas, at least," he said. She smiled. "Long before Christmas." He tipped his head to one side. "And Simon? I think Claire can handle him a little longer. With the assistance, of course, of the parlour-maid, the cook, Calhoun, and probably even Morrie." "Not Morrie, I'm afraid. Simon's screams completely unman the poor fellow." His smiling gaze locked with hers. He swept a low, formal bow. "May I have the pleasure of this dance, my lady?" She sank into a deep curtsy and rested her fingertips on his proffered arm. "I would be honoured, my lord." They moved into place as the music began. Together they wove through the stately patterns of the dance, pas simple, alternating with pas double, feet gliding, hands touching and releasing, bodies dipping and swaying in an age-old allegory of advance and retreat. She surrendered herself to the music and the all-too-fleeting pressure of his palm against hers. And then the music ended, and with it, the moment. They arrived back at Brook Street some time later to find a sealed billet addressed by an unfamiliar hand. While Hero hurried upstairs to Simon, Sebastian tore open the seal and glanced through the brief note. "There is something I must tell you. I shall be at home this evening, awaiting your visit. Sterling." "When did this come?" he asked Morrie. "Only moments after you left, my lord. I asked the lad who brought it if it was urgent, but he assured me it was not." Sebastian glanced at the clock and said, "Damn." Chapter 26. Thursday, the 25th of March. The next morning, Sebastian was preparing to leave for Chatham Place when an angry peal sounded at the front door. "Who's that?" he asked, settling a length of starched cravat around his neck. His valet, a slim, fair-haired, dapper man in his 30s, named Jules Calhoun, glanced out the window. "Judging by the crest on the carriage door, I'd say it's your lordship's sister, Lady Wilcox." Sebastian kept his attention on the delicate task of tying his cravat. Calhoun said, "Shall I tell Morrie to deny you?" A woman's determined tread sounded on the stairs. "I don't think Lady Wilcox intends to allow herself to be denied." Sebastian reached for his coat. "There's a hussar captain named Hugh Wyeth staying at the Shepherd's Rest in Knightsbridge. He was wounded in Spain last November and is still recuperating, although he could be exaggerating the lingering effects of his injuries for my benefit. He presents himself as genial, uncalculating, and even-tempered. I'd be interested to know if he truly is." A valet smoothed the set of the coat across Sebastian's shoulders. Calhoun was a genius at repairing the ravages that the pursuit of murderers could sometimes wreak on Sebastian's wardrobe. But he also possessed other, considerably more unusual talents that made him especially valuable to a gentleman with Sebastian's interests. Amanda's footsteps sounded in the hall. "If he's not," said Calhoun, "the staff at the inn should know it. I'll see what they have to say. I'd also be interested in learning more about his movements last Sunday. But be careful," Sebastian warned as Calhoun moved to open the door. "If Wyeth is our killer, the man is dangerous." A roguish gleam showed in the valet's eyes. "You'll never know I've been asking about him, never you fear." He opened the door and bowed as Amanda swept past him. "Lady Wilcox." Amanda ignored him. "Dear Amanda," said Sebastian, reaching for his driving gloves as Calhoun quietly withdrew. "What a distinctly unfashionable hour for a social visit." Amanda's nose quivered with the intensity of her dislike. "This isn't a social visit." The eldest of 4 children born to the Countess of Hendon, Amanda was 12 years Sebastian's senior. She'd been blessed with their mother's slim, elegant figure and glorious golden hair, but she had inherited the Earl's rather blunt features instead of the Countess's famous beauty, and a lifetime of angry resentment had by now etched a permanently sour expression on her face. "You're at it again, I hear," she snapped, "dabbling in a murder investigation like some common Bow Street runner." "I don't know if I'd use the word dabbling exactly." "You know this is the beginning of Stephanie's 2nd season, yet you accost the Home Secretary in the middle of Countess Lieven's ball. Countess Lieven, of all people! One might almost suspect you of deliberately attempting to ruin my daughter's chances of securing an advantageous alliance." Sebastian studied his half-sister's haughty, angry face. She had never made a secret of her dislike of him, even when they were children, but it was only recently that he'd come to understand why. Had she been born male, the title of Viscount Devlin, heir to all the Earl of Hendon's vast estates, would have been hers. But because she was a girl, that coveted position had gone instead to Hendon's firstborn son, Richard. After Richard's death, Hendon's 2nd son, Cecil, had become Viscount Devlin, and with Cecil's death the mantle had passed to Sebastian, the boy-child who was not even Hendon's own son, but a byblow produced by an illicit liaison between the Earl's lovely Countess and some nameless, unknown lover. "As it happens, I like Stephanie," said Sebastian, drawing on his gloves. "Then one can only assume you are doing this in some vicious attempt to harm me." The extent of his sister's capacity for self-absorption still had the power to stun him, even after all these years. "Actually, Amanda, I am doing this because somewhere out there, walking the same streets as you and I, is a very brutal, dangerous killer." "You are Viscount Devlin," she said through gritted teeth. "However unfit you may be to occupy such an exalted station, it is nonetheless yours, and one might hope you would at least attempt to exert yourself to behave accordingly." He flexed his hands in the tight leather gloves, then reached for his high-crowned hat. "You could try consoling yourself with the thought that I'm not being paid for my efforts, so at least our exalted name remains unsullied by the stench of trade." A flare of raw hatred glittered in the depths of her eyes, those blue, sincere eyes that were so unlike Sebastian's own yellow ones. "I should have known better than to try to talk to you," she said. "Yes, you really should have." He glanced at the mantel clock. "And now you must excuse me, Amanda. I've someone to meet." "You still intend to continue this nonsense, despite everything I've said?" "Yes." "You bastard!" "Yes," he said again, and watched her sweep from the room. Dr. Douglas Sterling's rooms lay on the 2nd floor of a late 18th-century brick building near the northwestern corner of Chatham Place. The address was not fashionable, but it was respectable, the street doors shiny with a fresh coat of green paint, the banister of the grand staircase fragrant with beeswax, the carpet underfoot worn but not threadbare. Sebastian could hear a woman singing sweetly in the rooms overhead, but when he reached the upper corridor and rapped on Sterling's door, the knock went unanswered. He'd already checked the physician's favourite coffee-house across the place, only to be told that the old man had yet to put in an appearance. "Ain't like him not to be here," the coffee-house owner had said in response to Sebastian's inquiries. In fact, I was about to send one of my lads over to check and see if he's all right. He's always here 5 minutes after I open every morning. You could set your watch by him, you could." Sebastian knocked again at the old doctor's door, aware of a rising sense of disquiet. "Dr. Sterling?" he called. An eerie, oppressive stillness hung in the air. Even the singing woman upstairs had quieted. Sebastian tried the knob and felt it turn in his hand. Hesitating, he reached for the dagger he kept in his boot, then slowly pushed open the door. The panel creaked inward on its hinges, revealing a room still in heavy shadow and crowded with furniture, as if the resident had moved here from more expansive quarters, yet been loath to part with any of his belongings. "Dr. Sterling," he called again, even though the silence in the rooms was absolute, the drapes at the front windows overlooking the square still drawn tight. He could feel his breath quickening and his pulse pounding as his eyes adjusted quickly to the darkness. He threaded his way through the crowded furniture toward the inner room. "Dr. Sterling?" The old physician lay sprawled just inside the doorway to the bedroom, his back a ripped, bloody mess, his hands curled up as if he'd been reaching for something as he fell. His old-fashioned powdered wig lay near one shoulder, but his neck ended in a raw, pulpy mess of flesh and bone and sinew. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sebastian, the gorge rising in his throat as his gaze followed a trail of blood to the bed. Nestled amidst the pillows, Douglas Sterling's bald head stared back at him with wide, sightless eyes. "Damn," said Sebastian, wiping the back of one hand across his mouth. "Damn, damn, damn." "It doesn't make any sense," said Lovejoy, staring down at the aged physician's bloody body. "No," agreed Sebastian. Lovejoy rubbed his eyes with one thumb and forefinger and sighed. "When you spoke with him yesterday, he gave no hint of the purpose of his meeting with Stanley Preston last Sunday. None. But something must have happened to frighten him, or at least make him reconsider his silence, because he sent a message last night asking to see me. Unfortunately, it was nearly midnight by the time I received it." Lovejoy blew out a long, troubled breath. "I wonder what he knew." Sebastian shook his head. He could see no obvious connection between Sterling and the various individuals he'd come to suspect of involvement in Preston's murder. "Have you ever heard of a man named Diggory Flynn?" asked Sebastian. The magistrate looked over at him. "No. Who is he? That's what I'd like to know. He was following me in Houndsditch yesterday, and he may well be the same man Lady Devlin noticed watching her earlier." Lovejoy frowned. "Lady Devlin? Good heavens! I'll set some of the lads to looking into him. Diggory Flynn, you say?" "Yes. You think he's involved in all this?" "He might well be." Lovejoy watched the men from the dead house shift Sterling's headless corpse onto the shell they would use to carry the murdered man to Paul Gibson's surgery. "I wonder how long the poor fellow's been dead." "Some hours, I'd say. Probably since last night." Lovejoy turned to survey the overcrowded rooms. "No sign of a struggle or forced entry that I can see." "No, which suggests he knew his killer, let him in, then realized his mistake too late and turned to run." "And was stabbed in the back?" Sebastian nodded. "Multiple times." They watched as one of the men from the dead house carefully lifted the doctor's head from the pillow and rested it atop his torso. "Let's hope he was dead before that was done to him," said Lovejoy, pressing his folded handkerchief to his lips. "What I don't understand is, why? Why cut off their heads?" "I suspect if we can figure that out, it will tell us who the killer is." "Perhaps," said Lovejoy, although he didn't sound convinced. Chapter 27. Dr. Sterling? Dead? Anne Preston stared at Sebastian with parted lips, her nostrils pinched, her eyes wide with horror. If it was an act, it was a good one. He had come upon her walking in the weak, fitful sunshine in her garden, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and her head bowed as if she were lost in thought. "I'm sorry," said Sebastian. "Would you like to sit?" "No," she said, although he noticed the hand holding her shawl clenched into a tight fist, and her chest rose and fell jerkily with her agitated breathing. "He didn't die naturally of old age, did he? Tell me truthfully," she added, when Sebastian hesitated. "No." She swallowed hard. Did the killer cut off his head too? When Sebastian remained silent, she let out a soft moan and whispered, "Oh, dear God, he did, didn't he?" "Are you certain you wouldn't like to sit?" said Sebastian. She shook her head fiercely. "At least he died quickly," said Sebastian, although the truth was he had no idea how long the aged physician had taken to die. The answer to that question would presumably come from Paul Gibson's post-mortem. They turned to walk together along a sunken, mossy brick path, the hem of her mourning gown brushing the plantings of lavender and rosemary beside them. "He was a good man," she said, her voice quivering. "I know he could seem cranky and irascible and opinionated, but beneath it all he was gentle and caring and harmless. Why would anyone want to kill him?" "Did you see him last Sunday when he came to visit your father?" "Only as he was leaving." "Do you know why he came?" "No." She kept her gaze fixed on the weathered wooden gazebo at the end of the path. "I asked Father if he was ill, but he said no. He said Dr. Sterling had only stopped by to talk about old times." "How did your father seem after the physician left?" She looked over at him, her brows pinched together with confusion. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "Was he pleased to have visited with an old acquaintance? Or upset, perhaps even angry?" She stared out over the ancient garden toward the new row houses of Sloane Street. "He did seem a bit preoccupied, even a bit angry, but I don't know why." "He didn't say anything at all, that might indicate what the two men discussed?" "No. But it was shortly after that he called for a hackney and went off for a few hours." "Did he do that often? Call for a hackney, I mean, rather than take his own carriage?" "Sometimes, yes. Often he'd simply walk into the city if the weather wasn't too bad." "He liked to walk?" "Yes." "Did he often walk at night?" "Oh, no. Only as far as his pub." A faint smile touched her lips, then faded into something sad and painful. "He was accosted by footpads once as a young man, and while London is considerably safer these days than it was in the last century, he's still worried." It fit with what Knightley had told him, but it made Preston's behaviour that fatal night all the more troublesome. "You still can't think of why he might have gone to Bloody Bridge that night?" "No. I'm sorry." "Had he said anything to you about his plans to purchase several new items for his collection? Some Stuart relics?" "No." They'd reached the gazebo at the end of the path, and she turned toward him. "I've had the constables here again asking about Captain Wyeth. They think Hugh did it, don't they? They think he killed my father." "They certainly consider him a strong suspect, I'm afraid." "But I told you! Hugh would never have killed Father, never." "Yet they did quarrel." She sucked in a quick breath. "Hugh told you about that, did he?" "Yes." A faint hint of colour touched her cheeks. I'm sorry I tried to deceive you." She certainly looked contrite. Yet would she have admitted the deception had she not realized he'd learned the truth? He doubted it. He said, "Captain Wyeth also told me that you and he are considerably more than friends." Her chin came up before she could stop it, and Sebastian knew he'd read her right. She said, "We are, yes. But Father didn't know that." She gazed at him with wide, still eyes, as if she could somehow will Sebastian into believing her. "I swear it." He raised one eyebrow in polite incredulity. "You swear it, Miss Preston?" To his surprise, her lips trembled, and she turned away from him, her eyes blinking rapidly, one fist coming up to press against her mouth. "Oh, God," she said, with a desperation he suspected was all too real. "You must believe me. Hugh did not do this." "It might be easier to believe you if you tried being a tad more honest." She looked at him over her shoulder, eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I'm sorry. It's just... I'm terrified Hugh is going to hang for this, and he didn't do it." So certain, thought Sebastian. But all he said was, "I'm told your father swore he'd disinherit you if you married Captain Wyeth. Did he issue that threat to you?" "He did, and I told him I didn't care. I told him there's more to life than wealth and a family's position in society." "What was his response?" Her eyes flashed with remembered wrath and indignation. "He said I was too young to know what I was talking about." "When was this?" She wiped the heel of her hand across her wet eyes. "Saturday evening." "And then what happened?" "He left." "Is that when he went to confront Captain Wyeth?" She nodded. "But Hugh didn't kill him. You must believe me." She sniffed rather loudly. "Hugh told you about Father's quarrel with Basil Thistlewood over the Duke of Suffolk's head, didn't he?" "He did, yes." "Did you speak to Thistlewood?" "I did." "And?" "He says he didn't kill your father." "Well, he would say that, wouldn't he?" She leaned toward him earnestly. "It was not their first confrontation, you know. About a month or so ago, Thistlewood acquired a rosary supposedly made from some old saint's bones. He was extraordinarily proud of it. Only, when Father inspected it, he challenged its authenticity. Thistlewood was furious, beyond furious. Swore if he heard Papa was going around telling people the thing was a fake, he'd kill him." "You mean the St. Anthony of Padua rosary Thistlewood has on display?" "Yes. That's it." "And what was your father's reaction?" "He laughed in Thistlewood's face." "Yet this was, as you said, a month ago." "Yes, but don't you see? If Thistlewood was already furious with Father because of the rosary, and then realized Father had bested him over Suffolk's head, it might well have driven him to murder." "Perhaps. Only what possible reason would Thistlewood have to kill Dr. Douglas Sterling?" She stared at him. It was obvious the question hadn't occurred to her. "I don't know. But Hugh had no reason to kill Dr. Sterling either." "So who did have a reason to kill both men?" She pushed the short curls away from her forehead in an exasperated gesture. "I don't know." Sebastian studied her pale, strained face with its small, delicately moulded nose and trembling mouth, and he knew an upsurge of frustration and irritation mingled with no small measure of sympathy. Anne Preston was so desperate to convince him and Bow Street that Captain Hugh Wyeth did not kill her father, she'd say anything. The problem was, Sebastian suspected, she was even more desperate to convince herself. Chapter 28. Sebastian knew he could in all likelihood discount the vast majority of what Anne Preston had told him, but on the off chance there was something to her accusations, he decided to pay another visit to Basil Thistlewood. He found the curiosity collector in a lean-to workshop attached to the rear of his Cheyne Walk establishment, a leather apron tied over his old-fashioned clothes. A half-constructed display case stood on the workbench before him. "Thought you'd be back," said Thistlewood, looking up for only a moment before returning to his task. Sebastian let his gaze wander around the surprisingly tidy space, with its rows of well-oiled tools and neat stacks of fine wood. Oh? Why's that? Ain't found Preston's killer, have you? No, said Sebastian, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe. You didn't tell me you had another conflict with the man just a few weeks ago. Basil Thistlewood kept his focus on the thin strip of wood he was measuring. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone hereabouts that Preston didn't have more than one run-in with. The man was opinionated and quick to take offence. Sebastian found himself smiling. In his observation, the description could be applied to Thistlewood as easily as Preston. Tell me about the rosary. Thistlewood grunted and walked over to select another length of wood from his stack. Always trying to show off, he was, acting like he was the big expert, because he went to Cambridge and I didn't. I weren't born yesterday, you know. Grew up in the business, I did. Preston questioned the rosary's authenticity. He did. Except he only decided it was questionable after I refused to sell it to him. If it weren't authentic, then why'd he want to buy it from me? You answer me that. I understand you were rather upset by his claims. Of course I was. Who wouldn't be? Questioning my judgment and knowledge like that? Cast aspersions on the authenticity of everything in my collection, it did. Did it? Well, of course it did. Thistlewood pointed one end of the narrow strip of wood at Sebastian. I can tell you right now, there's more than a thing or two in his collection that I wouldn't have in mine. Do you have any idea how many folks have stirrups said to have been used by Richard III at Bosworth Field? The man would have needed to be an octopus to have used half of them. Did you tell Preston that? I did. And that's when he turned ugly. Called me an impudent jackanapes, like he was some high and mighty lord of the manor, and me no more than a medieval serf tilling his lordship's fields. And I told him— Thistlewood broke off, his jaw sagging open in a ludicrous expression as he realized once again where his runaway mouth was leading him. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly up and down, and said more calmly, A man says things sometimes in the heat of the moment he don't mean. Things like, I could kill you. I may have said some such thing. Can't rightly recall it now. No? No. Ever hear of a man named Douglas Sterling? The sudden shift in topic seemed to confuse the coffee shop owner. Who? Dr. Douglas Sterling. Can't say I have. Who's he? An aged physician who lived in Chatham Place. Someone killed him last night. Cut off his head. Thistlewood carefully set down his strip of wood with a hand that was suddenly far from steady. An old man, you say? Why would someone want to kill him? Perhaps because he met with Stanley Preston less than 12 hours before Preston was killed. And now he's dead too? Yes. Thistlewood shook his head. Worrisome, ain't it? Sebastian studied the curiosity collector's mobile, almost comical face. Have you heard about the recent discovery out at St. George's, Windsor Castle? No. An eager gleam crept into Thistlewood's watery eyes. Has there been some new find? There has, although I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to go into the details. Thistlewood nodded. Heard they've been doing some digging in the crypt. Not surprised they run into something. When they was doing some work a few years back, they found a woman and child wrapped in lead. Obviously well-born they were, though nobody ever did figure out who they were. I got a look at them, and if you ask me, they dated back to Saxon times, maybe even late Roman. Wouldn't surprise me if there was an even older church on that very site. How did you happen to get a look at them? Asked Sebastian. Thistlewood gave a sly smile and winked. Knows folks, I do. Ever hear of a man named Diggory Flynn? Don't think so. Nah. He dead too? Not to my knowledge. He followed me yesterday evening after I'd paid a visit to Pris Mulligan's shop in Houndsditch." Thistlewood made a sucking sound with his tongue against the back of his teeth. "Told you she weren't somebody you wanted to cross. She claimed she hadn't seen Stanley Preston for a month or more." "She lies for a living, that woman, don't ever forget it. She got a new shipment in just last week, she did. And Preston was always one of the first she let know about it." "A new shipment from the continent, you mean?" "Aye. Told you she was in thick with smugglers, didn't I?" "So you did." Sebastian touched his hand to his hat. "You've been very helpful." The curiosity collector's wrinkled face broke into a wide smile. "I try. I do try." Sebastian stood beside the Thames, his gaze on the swollen brown waters of the river spreading out before him. The newly budding elms that edged Cheney Walk cast dappled patterns of light and shadow across the greening grass, and the strengthening spring sun felt warm on his shoulders, but the air was cold and damp. "Have I seen you before?" Pris Mulligan had said. "You look more'n a bit like that rifleman keeps a tavern just off Bishopsgate. Got those same nasty yellow eyes, he does." Sebastian was only too familiar with Jamie Knox, a one-time rifleman who owned the Black Devil near St. Helens, Bishopsgate. The resemblance between the two men, one an earl's heir, the other the son of a Shropshire barmaid, was as uncanny as it was inexplicable. Those unfamiliar with the Earl of Hendon might simply assume that Knox must be one of the Earl's byblows, but Sebastian knew better, knew that Knox was no more Hendon's son than was Sebastian himself. He narrowed his eyes against the fitful sunlight glinting off the water, felt the breeze off the river icy against his face. He didn't want to reopen the old wounds, didn't want to confront the unanswered questions associated with the mysterious rifleman. But the ties between Jamie Knox and the world of smuggling were murky, but indisputable. It was past time to pay a visit to the Black Devil. Chapter 29. The Black Devil stood in a narrow cobbled lane just off Bishopsgate, not far, Sebastian realized, from the Houndsditch shop of Pris Mulligan. Popular with the area's tradesmen and apprentices, it had half-timbered walls, twisted brick chimneys, and a high-gabled roof that marked it as a relic of a bygone era. He paused for a moment on the far side of the lane, his gaze travelling over the tavern's ancient diamond-paned windows, and the cracked wooden sign depicting a horned black devil dancing against the flames of hell. Then he crossed the street to push open the tap-room door. The interior of the tavern was as little altered as the exterior, its low ceiling supported by dark, heavy beams, its sunken flagged floor strewn with sawdust to absorb spills, the oak-panelled walls blackened by centuries of smoke from the vast stone hearth. The air was thick with the smell of tobacco and ale, and working men's sweat. "You," said the lovely, dark-haired young barmaid, her exotic almond-shaped eyes narrowed with animosity as she watched him walk up to her. "Yes, me," Sebastian said cheerfully, resting one forearm along the bar's scarred surface as he surveyed the crowded room. Jamie Knox was nowhere in sight. "Where is he?" "What you want with him? You're trouble, you are. I knowed it from the first time I seen you. You want a pint, I'll give you a pint. Otherwise, why didn't you just take yourself off?" Sebastian turned his head to meet her angry gaze. "I'll take a pint." "Make that 2 pints, Pippa," said Jamie Knox, "and bring them back here, if you will." Sebastian shifted to find the tavern owner leaning against the doorframe of a small back room that served as a kind of office. He was built tall and leanly muscled, taller even than Sebastian, with hair of a slightly darker shade. But the high-boned cheeks and gently curving lips were eerily the same as Sebastian's, as were the strange yellow eyes. Like the devil who danced on the tavern's painted sign, he was dressed all in black. Black coat and trousers, black waistcoat, black cravat. Only his shirt was white. His origins were as murky as his history. The son of a poor, unmarried barmaid. Knox claimed not to know the identity of his father. Once he'd been a rifleman with the 145th, a man famed for his eerily keen eyesight and animal-like hearing and quick reflexes. Discharged when his unit was reduced after the disaster at Corunna, he'd returned to England, some said to take to the High Toby as a highwayman, although there were also those who whispered he'd acquired the Black Devil simply by murdering its previous owner. The two men had first encountered each other some months before. They had never directly addressed the startling and inexplicable physical resemblance between them, never openly speculated on its possible causes or implications. But the awareness of it was always there, for both men a source of antagonism and an unwanted but undeniable bond. For Sebastian, it was an unwelcome reminder of a painful truth about his own paternity that had come close to destroying him. Yet it was also, beguilingly, a tantalizing clue to the identity of the unknown man who had bequeathed to him the same golden eyes and uncanny, wolf-like senses that Knox possessed. And Knox himself? Not for the first time, Sebastian found himself wondering how the rifleman viewed the unknown relationship between them. For one long moment the two men stared at each other. Then Sebastian pushed away from the bar and walked toward the man who might or might not be his half-brother. Knox stepped back to allow Sebastian to enter the room. "What do you want?" he asked without preamble. "How do you know I'm not simply thirsty?" Knox grunted. "Last I heard, there was no shortage of taverns in the East End." Sebastian went to stand at the small window overlooking the rear court. The tavern backed up against the wall of St. Helen's churchyard, so that from here he could see the tops of the weathered grey tombs and the winter-bared branches of the elms standing stark against the sky. He said, "It's a melancholy view. I can see it bothering some, such a constant reminder of death. Papa doesn't care for it, that's for sure." Sebastian turned to look at him. "And you?" Knox shrugged. "I've seen enough death in my life. I don't need to look out the window to be reminded that life is short and uncertain. Shorter for some than others. True." Sebastian leaned back against the windowsill. "There's a second-hand dealer in Houndsditch named Pris Mulligan. Deals in rare historical objects. I understand you know her." Knox reached for a clay pipe and began to fill the bowl with tobacco. "Let's just say that I know of her." "Why?" "I'm told a fair portion of her merchandise is smuggled in from the continent." "There's heaps of smugglers working the Channel these days," said Knox, without looking up from his task. "I hear she received a new shipment last week. Is that true?" Knox thrust a taper into the fire on the hearth and watched the end flare. "I didn't have anything to do with it, if that's what you're asking. But the shipment did arrive, so I hear." He held the taper to his pipe and sucked on it for a moment before looking up. "I don't do business with the woman myself. Any particular reason?" "The same reason I make it a practice to avoid rabid dogs and vipers' nests." "She's dangerous?" Knox blew out a long stream of tobacco smoke. "I think the word you're looking for is deadly." The two men's gazes met and held, then broke toward the door as Pippa came in carrying foaming pints of ale. Without even looking at Sebastian, she slammed the tankards down on the simple gate-leg table near the window, then left after throwing Knox a long, pregnant glare. Knox said, "I hear you've had a son. A future Earl of Hendon." "Yes. Congratulations." "Thank you. And yet you're still chasing after murderers?" How do you know I'm investigating a murder?" A gleam of amusement showed in the eyes that was so much like Sebastian's own. "It's the only time you ever come here." Must be something about the people you know." Knox sucked on his pipe, his lean cheeks hollowing, his expression enigmatic. Sebastian said, "Ever hear of a man named Diggory Flynn?" "Can't say I have." "Who is he?" "He doesn't work for Pris Mulligan?" "Not to my knowledge. But then I did mention I try to stay away from the woman." "Yet she knows you." "What makes you say that?" "She told me I look like you." "Ah." Knox reached for his ale and took a long, slow sip. He was silent for a moment, as if thoughtful. Then he said, "I hear someone tried to kill you the other night." "Where'd you hear that?" The tavern owner wiped the foam from his mouth with the back of one hand and smiled. Then the smile faded. "Does Pris Mulligan know you're looking into her?" "She does." "Why?" "There was a smuggler named Pete Carpenter tried to cheat Pris a few years back. He had a wife and 2 sons. The little boys weren't more than 4 or 5. He came home one day to find them chopped into pieces, with the bits deliberately positioned about the house, a head sitting up on the mantel, a leg on the kitchen table, a hand under the bed, that sort of thing. He never did find his wife." Sebastian felt the tavern keeper's words wash over him, raising the hairs at the back of his neck and sucking the moisture from his mouth as the horror of the tale and its implications hit his gut. He focused his attention on taking a long drink of his ale and swallowed hard before saying, "I take it you've heard about Preston and Sterling." "I have." Knox drained his own tankard and set it aside with a soft thump. "Some people are just flat-out evil. Pris Mulligan is one of them. If I were you, I'd be careful. Of yourself and of your family." Sebastian sat beside his library fire, a glass cradled in one palm, his gaze on the golden-red glow of the coals on the hearth. The house lay dark and quiet around him. He took a sip of the brandy, felt it burn in his throat. He was drinking too much lately, and he knew it. A slow, dangerous slide back into the self-destructive hell that had nearly consumed him in the months after he'd first returned to London. The clock on the hearth chimed 2, and then fell silent. In its wake, the stillness of the night felt like a heavy presence, oppressive and soul-sucking, and he was aware of the long, grueling hours of darkness stretching out ahead of him. He'd gone to bed with his wife, made slow, desperate love to her, then held her in his arms as she eased peacefully into sleep. He loved her with a tenderness and a passion that humbled, awed, and frightened him. He was closer to her than he had ever been to anyone, yet in some vital, inexplicable way he found himself feeling more alone and disconnected than ever. And so he'd slipped from her side to draw on his breeches and dressing gown, and come here. He took another sip of the brandy, his unnaturally acute hearing picking up the sound of her door opening far above, her light footsteps on the stairs. He held himself very still. He did not want her to find him like this, didn't want her to see his weakness and his fear and his uncertainty. She came up behind him and leaned over the chair to slip her arms around his neck and rest her linked hands against his chest. "You're thinking about them again, aren't you?" she said. "The women and children of Santa Eria?" "Yes." "You need to stop blaming yourself. You've dedicated years to making amends for a wrong that others did. But the past is past, and nothing you can do will ever change that. You can't keep torturing yourself like this." He tipped back his head to look up at her. Her face was golden in the firelight, the strength of her features accentuated by the shadows and framed by the heavy fall of her dark hair. He said, "I didn't tell you everything." She brought up a hand to run the backs of her fingers down his cheek. "I know." In the silence that followed, he heard the fall of ash on the hearth and the endless tick of the clock. Then she came around to sit on the rug beside him and rest the side of her head against his leg. He touched her hair, felt it slide soft and silky smooth through his fingers, and expelled his breath in a long, painful rush. "I watched the French kill them." "You don't need to tell me." He shook his head, kept his gaze on the fire. "I knew the French captain and his men had left their camp a good half an hour before I managed to escape. But I rode to the convent anyway. It was as if I couldn't believe that I was too late to warn them, to save them." He felt an ache pull across his chest. Some of the children had been playing in an orange grove at the end of the valley when the soldiers came up. The French must have galloped at them with sabres drawn, because the earth around them was trampled by the hooves of the horses. And the children— She touched his hand. "Sebastian." He swallowed, remembering how he'd stopped and knelt beside each slashed, bloodied little body. Two of the littlest ones, a boy and a girl, couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. Big brown eyes, baby soft, light brown hair. They looked enough alike that they were probably brother and sister, maybe even twins. They were still holding hands. They must have held on to each other when the soldiers rolled down on them. They were dead? All of them. And the French? I could hear horses neighing, men shouting, children screaming, women praying to God to save them. So I rode on. The convent was ancient, surrounded by a high sandstone wall, but the French had left the gates open. I could have ridden inside. I almost did. But at the last moment I turned into a copse of trees at the edge of the road. I stayed there and watched them kill everything and everyone inside that convent. Babies in their cradles, cattle, chickens, dogs, everything. And if you had ridden in, what do you think you could have done? You'd have been killed in an instant. Yes, but it seemed right that I should die with them. I wanted to die with them. Oh, God, Sebastian, no. He shook his head. The only reason I didn't was because I knew that if I stayed alive I could avenge them. I planned to start with Sinclair Oliphant, but by the time I made it back to headquarters he was gone, recalled to England on the death of his brother. So I set out after the French soldiers instead. I went back to the convent and tracked the troop that had done it, until they were in a vulnerable position. And then I betrayed them to the Spanish partisans. The Spaniards knew what those men had done at Santa Iria. The soldiers' deaths were not easy or quick. "And the captain?" she asked, her voice cracking. I'd meant to let the partisans have him too, but when I saw him again I couldn't stop myself. I beat him to death. He realized he'd clenched his fist and forced himself to open his hand. I tell myself he deserved to die, but what I did was little short of murder. And when it was over, I found I had no pleasure in his killing. The truth is, I live with his death and the deaths of his men as surely as I live with the deaths of the innocents of Santa Iria. It was war. No, it wasn't. It was revenge. Those women and children deserve justice. But there is no real justice in murder. He saw her sad smile, the almost imperceptible shake of her head. She drew the line between right and wrong in a different place than he. It was one of the ways in which they differed, one of the ways in which she was very much her father's daughter. He touched her face, ran his fingertips along the curve of her cheek. I believe those who die violently at the hands of others deserve justice. We owe them that. The problem is, by going after ruthless men and women, I run the risk of putting you in danger. You and Simon, too. He told her then what he'd learned from Knox about the threat Pris Mulligan might pose to them all. He said, "Promise me you'll be careful." She took his hand in hers, pressed a kiss to his palm. I knew what you did when I married you, Devlin. It's a part of who you are, a part of what I love about you. I won't try to pretend that I don't worry something might happen to you, because I do. The same way I worry about Simon catching a fever or coming down with the flux. But I refuse to be ruled by my fears. She gave him a lopsided smile. As for Simon and me, we're both constantly surrounded by a small army of servants. I don't think we're exactly vulnerable. He wanted to say, everyone is vulnerable. But some fears were best left unspoken. Chapter 30. Friday, 26th of March. The next morning, Sebastian drove toward the Tower of London to Paul Gibson's surgery. He left Tom to water the horses at the fountain near the ancient fortress's walls and slipped through the shadowy, narrow passage that led to the unkempt yard at the rear of the Irishman's old stone house. Only this time, in place of Gibson's throaty tenor warbling some Irish drinking song, he could hear a Frenchwoman's soft, clear voice singing, Madame a ce tourmente, mironton, mironton, mirontaine. He reached the open doorway to find Alexis Sauvage bent over the naked, eviscerated body of Douglas Sterling laid out on the stone slab before her. She had a leather apron tied over her simple gown and a bloody scalpel in one hand, and was singing softly to herself, Madame a ce tourmente, si haut qu'elle peut. What are you doing here? He demanded. He knew she had trained as a doctor in Italy, knew she must have done this sort of thing before, but finding her here was still disconcerting. A lock of flame-red hair fell across her eyes as she looked up at him. She pushed it back with one bent wrist. What does it look like I'm doing? Where's Gibson? She set aside the scalpel with a clatter. She was an attractive woman, with pale, delicate skin, and a high-bridged nose and brown eyes, dark now with an old hatred. Sebastian might have had good reason for killing the man she once loved, but he knew she'd never forgiven him for it. Gibson is... She hesitated, then finished by saying, not well today. Meaning what? Meaning your friend is an opium eater. How he managed to meet his responsibilities with even a semblance of normalcy before I arrived is beyond me. But I don't think he could have kept it up much longer. Sebastian studied her set, angry face. You said you could help him, yet you've not done so. She reached for a rag and wiped her hands. As long as he suffers the phantom pains from his missing leg, he will never be able to free himself of the opium. You said you can help him with that, too. Only if he allows it? Why would he not? Perhaps you should try asking him that yourself. She picked up her scalpel again. Although you're not likely to get a coherent response from him at the moment. Sebastian nodded to the decapitated body between them. What have you discovered? Not much. For an old man, Douglas Sterling was as healthy as an ox. He'd likely have lived another 10 or more years if someone hadn't stabbed him in the back and cut off his head. In that order? Yes. You're certain? Are you suggesting I'm incompetent? I'm suggesting you're probably not as good at this as Gibson, he thought. But all he said was, "Is there anything that might tell us who did this?" She gave him a tight, unpleasant smile. "I was under the impression that was your job." Sebastian shifted his gaze to where Sterling's bloodless head rested in a basin on the shelf, and for a moment all he could think about was the tale Knox had told him of the smuggler who'd come home to find his wife missing and his little boys hideously dismembered. He said, "Where's Gibson?" She shook her head. "You don't want to see him?" "No, but I think I should." Her gaze met his, but her eyes were hooded, and he couldn't begin to guess at her thoughts. Then she said, "He's in the parlour." He found Gibson sprawled in one of the old cracked leather chairs beside the cold hearth, his coat rumpled, his cravat gone, the collar of his shirt stained with sweat. Sebastian thought his friend lost in an opium-induced stupor. Then the Irishman looked up, his eyes hazy, his smile dreamy. "Devlin." Sebastian walked over to pour himself a brandy, then gulped it down in one long pull. "You're here about this latest headless fellow, I suppose?" Gibson waved one hand vaguely in the direction of the yard. "Haven't started yet, I'm afraid." Sebastian poured himself another drink. "Alexis Sauvage has almost finished the post-mortem." Something flickered across Gibson's features, then faded into bland contentment. "Has she now? She's very clever. Wish she'd marry me, but she won't." "She says your leg has been troubling you." "My leg?" Gibson's fuzzy smile never slipped. "I think about it sometimes. Still over there, doubtless a bare, weathered bone by now. While I'm here, not yet a pile of bare bones." When Sebastian said nothing, the surgeon drew in a slow, even breath that eased out like a sigh. "It's a bit like a woman, you know. Opium, I mean. Soft, caressing, deceptive. A delightful exaltation of the spirit mingled with cloudless serenity. Truly a gift from the gods." "That can kill," said Sebastian. Gibson's smile grew lopsided. "The gifts of the gods are often double-edged, are they not? Did you look at Sterling yourself at all?" "Oh," said Gibson, his head lolling against the back of the chair. "Sometimes I wish I were a poet, or maybe a composer, so I could share this joy and beauty. Everything's so much clearer, brighter, more intense. Delicious." His voice faded, and his gaze grew unfocused again, his face slack. A soft step in the passage drew Sebastian's gaze to the doorway. "He wouldn't have wanted you to see him like this," said Alexis Sauvage, her hands cupping her bent elbows close to her body, her voice low. Sebastian turned toward her, aware of a powerful rush of fear and guilt, all twisted up into a helpless rage that somehow ended up being directed at her. "God damn you! Why don't you help him?" "I told you. He won't let me." "Why not?" She shifted her gaze to the man now lost in a cloud of opium-hued bliss. Fear, embarrassment, a man's peculiar notion of pride. I don't know. You tell me. You're a man, his friend. All I know is he can't keep going on like this. It's destroying his mind and body, killing him. When will he be normal? She shrugged. He'll sleep for some time now. When he wakes, he'll be listless, depressed, nauseous. Tomorrow will be better than tonight. Sebastian set aside his second brandy, untouched. Then I'll be back tomorrow. Chapter 31. "What are we doing here?" asked Tom, as Sebastian drew his curricle to a halt at the side of the lane leading to Bloody Bridge. The sky was light blue and marbled with ripples of white clouds, the spring air rich with the smell of freshly turned earth and budding leaves, and the smoke rising from the chimneys of the nearby cottages. Sebastian handed the boy his reins. "Thinking," he said, and dropped lightly to the ground. He could feel the drying, muddy ruts of the roadway crumble beneath his boots as he walked toward the bridge, his gaze drifting over the expanse of market and nursery gardens that stretched away to the east. The tolling bell of a small country chapel, its tower barely visible above a distant cluster of trees, was carried on the cool breeze. Frowning, he turned to look back at Sloane Square, now drenched with a rich golden sunlight. "So, what you thinking?" asked Tom, watching him. "No one seems to be able to tell me what Stanley Preston was doing here on a rainy Sunday night." "Some folks just like to walk in the rain," said Tom. "Never made no sense to me, but 'tis a fact." "True. Yet Preston was afraid of footpads, and Bloody Bridge has a decidedly nasty history." Sebastian went to hunker down in the grassy verge where they'd found Preston's decapitated body sprawled on its back. There was no sign now that it had ever been there. He rested a forearm on one thigh. "Molly Watson from the Rose and Crown says Preston's greatcoat was open, with his pocket watch dangling on the grass beside him." "You think somebody was going through his pockets, looking for something?" "That's one explanation." Tom screwed up his face in puzzlement. "There's another?" "He was stabbed in the back, which suggests he either turned his back on his killer, obviously not a wise thing to do, or he didn't hear the killer come up behind him." Sebastian rose to his feet. "When do people typically look at their watches?" "I dunno. Never had one myself." Sebastian found himself smiling. "Men generally check their watches when they're late for an appointment, or when someone else is late." "So you're saying you think he was here to meet somebody? Somebody who was late?" "I think so, yes. And whoever it was, that person was obviously someone Preston was extraordinarily anxious to see." "How do you know that?" "Because Preston was afraid of Bloody Bridge at night, yet he still agreed to come here, alone, after dark." Sebastian stared across the open green of Sloane Square toward Chelsea, and the river that flowed out of sight at the base of the hill. Anyone travelling down from Windsor to deliver the stolen royal relics to Preston would, in all likelihood, have come by the Thames. If he landed at Cheyne Walk, he would need only to come up the short stretch of Paradise Row and skirt the shadowy gardens of Chelsea Hospital and the Royal Military Asylum in order to reach Sloane Square and, just beyond it, the quiet, deserted lane to Bloody Bridge. Above Sloane Square lay the long, straight stretch of Sloane Street and Hans Place, both well-lit and heavily travelled, the kinds of places where a man might be seen and recognised. So Bloody Bridge was not simply out of the way and little frequented. It was essentially halfway between Alford House and the river. Sebastian went to stand at the edge of the rivulet where he'd found the ancient inscribed length of lead strapping. He was now fairly certain that Stanley Preston had come here that night to take possession of the relics from a thief whose identity Sebastian still didn't know. Was it a trap? Possibly. If so, who had set it? Pris Mulligan? Thistlewood? Oliphant? Or had the killer simply taken advantage of Preston's unwise decision to venture alone to such a dark, out-of-the-way spot? And what about the thief? Had he arrived before or after the murder? Impossible to say. But the thief had been there. The presence of the coffin strap proved that. So, who was the thief? And where was the king's head? "What sort of fellow arranges a meeting in a dark, out-of-the-way spot?" said Sebastian. "Someone who don't want nobody to see him," said Tom in triumph. Turning away from that death-haunted bridge, Sebastian went to leap up into the curricle's high seat and take the reins. "Exactly." "Stop glowering at us, Jarvis," grumbled George, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, Regent of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Swallowing a half-masticated mouthful of buttered crab, the prince reached for his wine-glass and drank deeply. "But enough to give us indigestion." They were in one of Carlton House's private withdrawing rooms, the table before the prince spread with a feast intended to still the hunger pains that so often came upon His Highness in the mid-afternoon. "Your meeting with the Russian ambassador," Jarvis began, "can be put off until tomorrow," said the prince, negligently waving a delicate silver fork piled with more crab. "The Countess of Hertford should be here any moment. You wouldn't expect me to forego such a treat now, would you?" He flashed a smile that was meant to be roguish, but came off simply as simpering and foolish. He was 50 years old and grossly fat, his once handsome features coarsened by decades of dissipation and excess. But in his own mind he was still the dashing young Prince Florizel, who charmed the nation that now despised him for his extravagance and his irresponsibility and his breathtaking selfishness. Jarvis kept his own features bland. One did not reach or retain his position of power by indulging in useless displays of annoyance and contempt. "The ambassador has been waiting 3 hours. "Then one would think he'd welcome the opportunity to go home. Tell him to come back tomorrow, and take yourself off as well, before you bring on my spasms." Any spasms the prince was likely to suffer would owe considerably more to the pile of crab and 2 bottles of Burgundy he'd already consumed than to the demands of his royal responsibilities. But Jarvis bowed and said, "Yes, sir." He'd almost reached the door when the prince said, "Oh, and Jarvis, I trust the arrangements for the formal opening of Charles I's coffin are all in place." Jarvis paused. "The opening is scheduled for the 1st of April, the day following your aunt the Duchess's funeral." "Excellent." George gave a wide, slightly greasy smile. "What a treat it will be." Jarvis bowed again and withdrew. He spent the next half-hour soothing the outraged Russian ambassador's ruffled sensibilities and averting a minor diplomatic crisis. Then, feeling in need of a good strong drink, he returned to his own chambers to find his son-in-law, Viscount Devlin, leaning against the sill of the window overlooking the forecourt, his arms folded at his chest and his boots crossed at the ankles. "What the devil are you doing here?" demanded Jarvis, going to pour himself a glass of brandy. "Have your men made any progress in their efforts to track down Charles I's missing head?" "They have not. Have you?" "No." Jarvis eased the stopper from the crystal decanter and poured a healthy measure into one glass. "I won't offer you a brandy, since you're not staying." The Viscount smiled. "When's the formal opening to be?" Jarvis set aside the decanter and turned to face him, glass in hand. "Next Thursday." "How many people know Charles's head is missing?" "The Dean and the Verger of St. George's, and the 2 men I've tasked with the item's recovery." "Why?" "I assume all have been sworn to secrecy." "Naturally." "I plan to drive out to Windsor Castle in the morning and take a look at the royal vault. It might be helpful if you sent a message instructing the Dean and the Verger to cooperate with me." Jarvis took a long drink, then paused a moment before saying, You've found evidence to suggest these rather macabre murders are indeed linked to the theft from the royal crypt. Evidence? No. Jarvis grunted. I'll send the message, but you will keep me informed. It was not a question. Devlin pushed away from the window. Of course. Jarvis waited until the Viscount had taken himself off. Then he rang for his clerk. Send Major Archer to me, now. Chapter 32. That evening, Sebastian and Hero were sitting down to dinner when a peal sounded at the front door. His gaze met hers. Expecting anyone? No, she said, just as Maury appeared in the doorway with a bow. Lord Sidmouth to see you, my lord. I have taken the liberty of showing his lordship into the library. Sebastian found the Home Secretary pacing back and forth before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his chin sunk into the folds of his snowy white cravat. He wore the silk knee-breeches, white silk stockings, and buckled evening shoes of a man dressed for a formal dinner or a ball. But when he turned toward Sebastian, his face was pinched and pale. "My lord," said Sebastian, "may I offer you some wine? A brandy?" "Thank you, but no. I won't keep you long. My apologies for interrupting your evening. Please, have a seat." Sidmouth drew up with his back to the fireplace and shook his head. "I looked into the incident in Portugal you told me about, the one involving the convent." He sucked in a quick, jerky breath. My God, how could anyone do something like that? Sebastian had never had much respect for Sidmouth. He was typical of the sycophants who hung around the court, ambitious, venal, and opportunistic. Yet it said something for the man that he still recoiled in horror from an act of such calculated cynicism. Sebastian walked over to splash brandy into 2 glasses and held one out to the Home Secretary, who took it without comment and downed half the contents in one long, shaky pull. Sebastian said, "Tell me what happened between Oliphant and Stanley Preston." Sidmouth brought up a hand to rub his eyes with one splayed thumb and forefinger. "Most colonial governors find ways to use their positions for personal gain. It's virtually expected, actually, but some go too far. Bribery, corruption." The Home Secretary nodded and blew out a long, harsh breath. "I began hearing about the problems between James Preston, Stanley's son, and the new governor almost as soon as Oliphant arrived in Jamaica. It seemed as if every other week brought a different complaint from Stanley. For the most part, I ignored them. You know what Stanley was like. But then things became more serious. Oliphant confiscated a valuable stretch of the Prestons' largest plantation. He claimed the land was needed to build a public road, although everyone knew the road was solely for the benefit of one individual, a large landowner who paid Oliphant handsomely for his efforts. When was this? Last spring. Sidmouth paused to take another gulp of his brandy. By that point we'd started receiving complaints from other prominent colonial figures. It was obvious that something needed to be done, but Oliphant has some powerful backers which limited my ability to act. I told Stanley that if he wanted Oliphant recalled, he needed to find something else, something less personal and more injurious to the interests of the Crown." "That's when Preston went out to Jamaica himself?" "Yes. He was determined to dig up something he could use." "And he found it?" "He did. To be frank, I could scarcely believe it at first. I mean, bribery and corruption are one thing, but flaunting the laws against the slave trade is something else entirely." "You're saying Oliphant was involved in slave-running?" Sidmouth nodded. "It's become extraordinarily lucrative, now that the slave trade has been shut down." Sebastian doubted a slave owner like Stanley Preston would have had any personal moral objections to such activities, but the discovery would have served his purposes very well. The evidence was damning enough that Oliphant agreed to return to London, Sidmouth was saying. That should have satisfied Stanley. It would have any normal man. But not my cousin. He was determined to see formal charges brought against Oliphant, except then—
Sidmouth's voice trailed off.
"Yes?" prompted Sebastian.
"Last Saturday, the day before Stanley was killed, I ran into him in St. James's Street. Frankly, I was rather chagrined to see him, since he'd taken to seizing every opportunity, however inappropriate, to pester me about Oliphant. But, to my surprise, he said he was dropping the entire affair. I was stunned."
"Did he say why?"
"No, but he was behaving most peculiarly, very unlike himself."
"In what sense?"
"I think he was frightened, which puzzled me, because Stanley Preston was not a man who frightened easily. But he was afraid that day, and I think he was afraid of Lord Oliphant."
Sebastian studied the Home Secretary's strained features.
"Have you ever heard of a man named Diggory Flynn?"
"Who?"
"Diggory Flynn, a rather dishevelled individual with an oddly lopsided face. I could be wrong, but I believe he works for Sinclair Oliphant."
Sidmouth's heavy jaw went oddly slack.
"A lopsided face, you say?"
"That's right. Have you seen him?"
"No."
Sidmouth shook his head.
No.
But Sebastian noticed his hand was far from steady as he brought his brandy to his lips and drained the glass.
Sinclair, Lord Oliphant, was standing beside the EO table in a gambling hell near Portland Square when Sebastian came up to him. "We need to talk," said Sebastian. "Walk outside with me for a moment."
Oliphant kept his gaze on the spinning ball before him.
"I think not. Whatever you have to say to me can be said here.
You might change your mind when you hear that the topic of conversation is slave-running." The EO ball fell into one of the bar slots, and Sebastian said, "You lose anyway."
"Actually, I've yet to place a bet."
Oliphant's habitual faint smile never slipped, but his blue eyes narrowed and hardened, and he turned to walk out of the gaming hell's dim, smoky atmosphere into the startlingly clear, crisp night.
"Now, what is this about?" he demanded as they descended the front steps.
"I've just been listening to an interesting tale about how you used your position as Governor of Jamaica to cheat Stanley Preston out of a valuable section of his land. He swore to make you pay, and he did, by discovering that in addition to the usual bribery and corruption so common amongst Britain's colonial governors, you were also dabbling in the slave trade."
"The accusations were baseless,"
Oliphant said calmly as the two men turned their steps toward the square,
"which is why no charges were ever filed."
"Yet you did return to London."
Oliphant shrugged.
"The islands have a certain appeal, I'll not deny. But after a time, ennui sets in. I was more than ready to return to England."
"And Preston had nothing to do with it. Is that what you're saying?"
"That's right."
Sebastian shook his head.
"I think Preston wasn't content with having you quietly removed from the governorship. I think he was determined to see you publicly disgraced, and that's why you killed him."
Oliphant gave a brittle laugh and swung to face him.
"Do you seriously think I would allow some upstart merchant's grandson to drive me from a post I wish to retain? Me, an Oliphant of Calgary Hall?"
"Hardly. I tell you, the charges were unproven."
"Perhaps.
Yet Preston could conceivably have found the proof he needed to make them stick."
"I'm afraid your information is sadly inaccurate, Devlin. Stanley Preston and I had a nice little chat the Friday before he died, and the very next day he formally retracted his allegations."
Threatened him, did you? With what? Did you suggest that something vile might befall his daughter if he continued?
Does it matter? The point is, I had no reason to kill him. In fact, I had every reason not to, particularly in such a spectacularly gruesome fashion that could only serve to attract attention to the very falsehoods I wished to quiet. He could have changed his mind.
Oliphant gave a low laugh.
The man wasn't that stupid.
He started to brush past Sebastian, heading back toward the gaming house.
"Tell me about Diggory Flynn," said Sebastian.
Oliphant hesitated for the briefest instant, so briefly that Sebastian afterward wondered if he might have imagined it. Then he quickly mounted the steps, rapped sharply on the gaming house door, and disappeared inside. That night Sebastian dreamt of blood-soaked orange blossoms and a laughing man with mismatched eyes and a strangely lopsided face. He left his bed just before dawn, when the air was tangy and crisp, the dark streets below empty and quiet. He was standing at the window and watching the first hint of light spread across the sky, when Hero came to wrap her arms around his waist and press her warm, soft body against his naked back. She said, "Troublesome dreams?" He rested his hands on hers.
"Yes."
She laid her cheek against his shoulder. "I owe you an apology. I thought you were wrong, you know, that you were allowing your own past with Oliphant to influence your thinking about Stanley Preston's killer. But revenge and fear are powerful motives, and Oliphant obviously possessed both." Sebastian kept his gaze on the lightening sky above the rooftops.
"I could still be wrong. Sometimes I think I keep trying to prove that Oliphant is the murderer just so that I can kill him."
He paused as a chorus of morning birdsong filled the air, sweet and bright and achingly clear.
"But I'm still missing something vitally important, and I'm afraid more people are going to die because of it."
"Perhaps you'll find some hint of what it is at Windsor this morning," she said.
"Perhaps,"
he said, and turned to take her in his arms. Chapter 33. Saturday, the 27th of March. Sebastian reached Windsor shortly before 10 that morning. The sky was a limpid blue, filled with clusters of white clouds that turned the castle's soaring sandstone walls and towers by turns, moody and golden in the fitful spring sunshine. The black-cassocked man who hurried out into the lower court to meet his curricle was tall and rail-thin, with greasy limp hair and an extraordinarily large, toothy mouth.
"Lord Devlin," he exclaimed, bowing nearly double, "this is an honour, truly an honour. Allow me to introduce myself. Rowan Toop, my lord, verger of St. George's. Unfortunately, the Dean had a previous engagement this morning that will preclude him from meeting with you, but he sends his regrets and has instructed me to cooperate with you in every way possible."
He laced his long, bony fingers together and rested them against the front of his cassock, his face frozen in an eager grin that was wide enough to look almost painful.
"I understand the burial of the dead is under your charge," said Sebastian, dropping lightly to the ground.
He exchanged a meaningful look with Tom, who nodded almost imperceptibly before driving off toward the stables. Toop's grin faltered.
"It is, yes, to be sure, to be sure."
He bowed again.
"The Dean tells me you'd like to view the newly discovered royal burial chamber."
"That would be helpful, yes." The verger extended a hand toward St. George's ancient soot-stained facade.
"If you will come this way, my lord."
They climbed the steps to the grand royal chapel and pushed open one of the heavy, weathered west doors. The soaring, stone-vaulted nave lay hushed and empty in a rich, colourful light that poured in through the high rows of stained-glass windows above.
I fear this theft has been a shock to Dean Legg, a terrible shock," said Toop, as he paused in the narthex to light a simple horn lantern he then carried with them to the padlocked gate in the choir. Setting down the lantern, he fished a large iron key from the depths of his cassock and held it up as if for Sebastian's inspection. "Had this gate specially installed," he did. "Not that it did much good, unfortunately." Sebastian studied the stout iron bars and padlocked heavy chain. "When exactly was it installed?" "Ordered it put in just after Lord Jarvis's first inspection of the tomb, he did." "Immediately after?" Toop frowned as he carefully fitted the key into the lock. "Well, we had to have the gate made, of course. So it was a day or two before it was actually in place. That must have been when the thieves struck." "Thieves? What makes you think there were more than one?" "Just assumed it, I suppose." "Did anyone check Charles's coffin at the time of the gate's installation?" "Well, no. Why would we? I mean, Lord Jarvis left strict instructions that nothing was to be disturbed again until the Prince Regent's formal examination of the remains. And since we'd replaced the black velvet pall, it would have been impossible to see that the coffin had been tampered with, even if we had chanced to look into the vault again, which I don't believe anyone actually did. His lordship is not one you care to cross." The padlock clicked open, the clanking of the chain sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the deserted choir, as Toop unwound it from around the bars and swung the gate wide. "If you'll allow me to go first, my lord," he said, reaching for the lantern, "I'll be able to light the way for you. It's rather dark down there." "Who do you think stole the king's head?" Sebastian asked as he followed the verger down a narrow, sloping passageway, the light from the horn lantern bouncing and swaying over the rough walls. "Me?" Toop twisted around to stare back at Sebastian with wide, bloodshot eyes. "Good heavens, I can't imagine. We must always be careful with new burials on account of the resurrection men. But no surgeon is going to want a head that's more than 150 years old now, is he? I mean, what could he do with it? I can't imagine who'd want such a thing." "A collector?" suggested Sebastian. Toop's large mouth twisted into an exaggerated grimace. "He'd need to be powerfully queer, if you ask me. There are those for whom royalty exudes an extraordinary fascination, and there's something about the Stuarts that many find particularly compelling." The verger sniffed. "I've dealt with the dead for more than 20 years now, from the freshest corpses to musty 1,000-year-old bones. But I certainly wouldn't want some rotting head sitting around my house, king or no king. It's not healthy. It's not right. It's not normal." They drew up before a rough, man-sized opening in the passage's wall. "Ah, here it is," he said, stepping back as he held the lantern high. "After you, my lord." Stooping low, Sebastian entered a barrel-roofed vault lined with unfaced bricks, and scarcely wide enough to hold the 3 caskets that rested on its damp, bare floor. A dusty black velvet pall shrouded the coffin to his left, although the other 2 were uncovered. The smallest coffin against the far wall looked intact, but the largest of the 3, well over 6 feet in length, and obviously made broad enough to accommodate a man of enormous proportions, was so shattered that fragments of bone and shreds of discoloured, decaying shroud showed clearly through the broken sides and top. "Any indication that the other 2 coffins were also disturbed?" asked Sebastian. Rowan Toop ducked in behind him, the soft glow from his lantern sending their shadows ranging low and distorted across the ceiling and far wall. "Oh, no, my lord. Jane Seymour is still sealed up as tight as you could wish, while old Henry here looked like this when we found him. It was the gases from his bloated, putrefying body started it, you know.
burst the coffin open even before he was laid to rest. His corpse lay for the night in the chapel of Sion Abbey, while on its way here for burial, and when they went to collect him in the morning, they discovered the coffin had exploded. Dogs were feasting on the royal remains.
Divine retribution for the dissolution of the abbeys.
Rowan Toop gave another of his odd, almost comical grimaces.
Well, that's what they said at the time. Of course, I suspect it was only made worse when they stuck Charles in here.
Toop lowered his voice to a stage whisper.
Drop the one king on the other, if you ask me. What about the other royal vaults? Have they also been targeted by thieves?
Oh, no, my lord. We've checked, and all are secure.
Sebastian let his gaze wander around the crude, low-ceilinged crypt.
Seems an uncharacteristically humble place for a king like Henry VIII to have chosen to rest for eternity. Yes, but he didn't choose it, you see. He'd planned a magnificent tomb, with white marble pillars and gilded angels, and a life-sized equestrian statue of himself beneath a triumphal arch. Except that he didn't like to think about his own death, so only parts of it were finished by the time he went. Both he and Jane were supposed to be in here only temporarily, while the grand tomb was built, but none of his 3 children ever got around to completing it, and in the end even those bits that were finished were scattered. They say the bronze effigies of Henry and Jane were melted down during the Civil War. His grand black sarcophagus is now in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, with Horatio Nelson inside it. At least it was finally put to use. True.
Sebastian brought his gaze back to the time-worn black pall that draped the simple coffin of the murdered king. Toop cleared his throat uncomfortably.
Would you like to actually see it, my lord? Whoever stole the king's head cut a hole in the top of the coffin, although I must warn you it's not a pretty sight.
Sebastian had no desire to view any more decapitated bodies, but he acknowledged the need to verify what he'd been told.
Yes,
he said reluctantly. The verger swallowed hard and moved to draw back the old cloth.
He's extraordinarily well preserved. They often are, in crypts.
A heavy stench of decay wafted through the stale air. Sebastian took one look at the mouldering king's truncated neck and the discoloured depression left by his purloined head, and nodded.
That's good. Thank you.
He ducked back through the opening into the dark passage while the verger replaced the pall and carefully smoothed its aged folds.
How many people knew of the burial chamber's discovery?
Toop followed him with the lantern.
Truthfully, I'd say just about everyone in Windsor who isn't deaf or dead. There's no way to keep workmen from talking, I'm afraid. They go home and tell their wives, or their mothers and sisters, and then they go down to the pub and brag about it to their friends, and before you know what's what, the whole town is talking about it.
Yet it's one thing to know about the vault, and something else again to gain access to it.
Well...
Toop lowered his voice as they retraced their steps toward the surface.
I wouldn't say this in front of the Dean, but the truth is just about anybody could have got in here before the gate was up, if they'd a mind to do it. The castle might be a royal residence, but St. George's Chapel has always been open to the public.
Have you had trouble with things being taken before?
Now and then, yes,
said Toop, as they emerged from the dank passage into the incense-scented air of the choir.
Needless to say, the Dean is beside himself over this. He's always nourished ambitions of becoming a bishop, you see. But once the regent learns of this, as he surely will unless the head is somehow recovered...
He gave another of his rubbery-mouthed grimaces.
How long have you been verger here? asked Sebastian.
Me?
More than 15 years now, my lord.
Since before Dean Legg, then?
Oh, yes, my lord, long before.
His mouth stretched into a wide, toothy grin.
And I'll still be here long after he's moved on to other things, God willing.
Sebastian thanked him and left the verger there, still grinning aimlessly as he rewound the chain around the gated crypt entrance. He sent a message to the stables for Tom, then walked up the gate to the sunlit terrace overlooking the village and the old Royal Deer Park with its distant elm-lined long walk stretching for miles across the undulating countryside. His visit to Windsor Castle had proved to be frustratingly unenlightening. If Toop were to be believed, virtually anyone could have made away with King Charles I's head and coffin strap. How? Or even if that theft had played a part in Preston's death, was still murky. Sebastian braced his outthrust hands against the stone parapet edging the terrace, his gaze on the wind-tossed shadows of clouds chasing each other across the landscape below. The sense that he was missing something vitally important, continued to haunt him. A flock of pigeons rose in a sudden burst into the sky, wings whirling in alarm, and drawing Sebastian's attention to a dishevelled, slope-shouldered man standing with his back to the stone wall edging the steep approach to the gate. He caught Sebastian's gaze and nodded, his eyes alight with amusement. "Why the devil are you still following me?" Sebastian demanded, walking up to him. Diggory Flynn's full, crooked lips quirked up in a grin. "What makes you think I'm here 'cause of you?" "You just happened to take it into your head to visit Windsor this morning, did you? Is that what you would have me believe?" "Sure, then, but 'tis more pleasant than a day spent in the likes of Smithfield Market or Covent." Sebastian's hand flashed out to close around the other man's neck and shove him back against the low stone wall. Flynn let out a yelp, fingers digging into Sebastian's forearms as he bent the man backward over the parapet. "Here, what do you want to go and do that for?" "Let me warn you right now," said Sebastian, keeping his voice low and even. "Follow me if you like. I can deal with that. But if I hear you've been anywhere near my family again, I swear to God I'll kill you." The man's face contorted into a parody of pain. "Ouch! It's hurting me, you are." "Good." Sebastian tightened his hold on the man's throat. "Who sent you? I told you. I don't work for nobody." "I don't believe you." Diggory Flynn's eyes rolled sideways as he considered the drop-off behind him, his tongue flicking out to moisten his dry lips. "You can't kill me. People are watching. There's laws against murder in this country. Just 'cause you're a Viscount don't mean you can go around killing folk." "Don't worry," said Sebastian, releasing his grip on the man and taking a step back. "If I kill you, there won't be any witnesses." "That's supposed to reassure me." Flynn carefully straightened his grimy neckcloth and tugged at the hem of his worn, rucked-up waistcoat. "You're just trying to scare me, you are." "You should be scared. I mean what I say." Flynn's mismatched eyes widened ever so slightly. Then he pushed away from the old stone wall and scuttled off, his head down, the tails of his tattered coat fluttering in the breeze. "Who was that?" asked Tom, drawing the curricle up beside Sebastian. "I'm not quite certain." "He's a real Captain Queernabs, he is," said Tom. "A what?" "Don't you know? A Captain Queernabs is a cove what's dressed real shabby-like." "Here's that." Sebastian leapt up into the curricle. "Hear anything of interest in the stables?" "They're all talking about how someone prigged one of the old king's heads." "So much for swearing all interested parties to secrecy," said Sebastian, taking the reins. "Anyone have any idea who might be behind the theft?" "Oh, they got all sorts of ideas, but ain't no two alike." The boy scrambled back to his perch. "What'd you say was the name of that cove?" Sebastian gave his horses the office to start. "Flynn. Diggory Flynn." "Why?" "Calhoun was talking about somebody hanging around Brook Street the other day.
Somebody who sounded more'n a bit like yon Captain Queernabs.
Sebastian reined in hard and turned to stare at his tiger.
When was this?
Dunno. A few days ago. Why?
But Sebastian only shook his head, the wind cold on his face, as he whipped the horses for home. Chapter 34.
The things you got to understand,
said the costermonger, leaning against the side of a donkey cart piled high with whole fresh fish, still glistening and wet from the market,
is that not everybody selling on the streets is a coster.
Oh, said Hero, intrigued by the costermonger's determination to hold themselves apart from all other street sellers.
Course not,
said the coster. He was a big man named Micah McDougall, with beefy arms and a wind-reddened face, and dark hair covered by a small cap.
Why, the Dutch buy-a-broom girls, the Jew old clothesmen, the pea soup and bread and butter sellers, the wooden spoon makers, ain't none of them proper costermongers.
So what makes one a proper costermonger?
Proper costermongers sell stock we buys at the fruit and vegetable and fish markets. Some of us has stalls or stands in the streets, and some of us makes rounds with a barrow or donkey cart. But you'll never find a costermonger selling tatted hair nets or wooden clothes pins.
He wrinkled his nose in disdain. How far do you travel on your daily rounds?
Oh, usually 9 or 10 miles.
That's quite a distance to walk every day.
Nah. Sometimes in the summer, Liz and me'll go on country rounds for as much as 25 miles.
Liz? The coster grinned and shifted to lay an affectionate arm across his donkey's withers.
Liz.
The donkey peeled its lips away from its long teeth and let out a loud ee-aw. Do you live around here? Hero asked.
Oh, no. We lives off Fish Street Hill, me lady. You'll find most costermongers what deals in fish lives thereabouts, so we're close to Billingsgate Market.
You have children?
I got 3. 2 boys and a girl. 2 are 5, but 2 of the little ones died of fever afore Christmas.
I'm sorry. The costermonger twitched one shoulder and swallowed hard. Hero said, Do you think your children will grow up to be costermongers? He swiped a meaty hand down over his whisker-stubbled face.
Sure then, we're already sending them out to sell nuts and oranges and watercress. The streets teaches them what they needs to know. Why, they're sharp as terriers, little as they are. They has to be. They know better than to come home if they ain't done well.
Hero was careful to keep her instinctive reaction to his words from showing on her face. How old are they?
The girl's 8, and the boys is 5 and 7.
Your wife is a costermonger as well?
Aye, she works Fleet Street. This time of year she sells flowers all a-growing, but come June she'll switch to peas and beans, then cherries and strawberries in July.
Remembering what Mattie Robinson had told her, Hero was tempted to ask if his wife actually was his wedded wife. Instead, she said, Was your father a costermonger?
Oh, aye, and his father afore him. You'll find most costermongers proper was born into the business. The ones I feel sorry for is the mechanics and labourers what have lost their jobs and try turning their hand to selling in the streets. They think it looks easy, but it ain't, and they almost never do well.
Why not?
Ain't up to the dodges, you see. The problem is, they go out into the streets with fear in here.
He thumped one meaty fist against his chest.
They don't know how to bargain, and they ain't good salesmen. Poor buggers. Begging your pardon, your ladyship. I mean, poor fellows. They almost always end up losing everything.
He shook his head sadly.
For them, it's just another way of starving.
The donkey shifted its weight and shook its head, rattling the harness.
I've got to move on, me lady. Liz here is getting restless.
Thank you for your time, said Hero, handing the costermonger his shillings. The money disappeared into one of his coat's deep flapped pockets.
"You're really going to write about the Costas?"
"Yes."
"Why?"
"Because no one ever has." But Micah MacDougall simply shook his head, as if the ways of the quality were beyond his comprehension. Chapter 35. Sebastian arrived back at Brook Street to find Hero still out on her interview and Claire Bissett preparing Simon for an outing in the park.
"Take one of the footmen with you,"
Sebastian told her, his voice sounding more curt than he'd intended. Claire stared at him.
"A footman? Just humour me, Claire."
"I'll get Edward," she said, still vaguely frowning as she turned away, the bundled-up child wide-eyed in her arms. Sebastian walked into the library, poured himself a drink, and sent for Jules Calhoun.
"Tom says you saw some Captain Queernabs near the house a few days ago,"
he said when the valet appeared a few minutes later.
"Tell me about him."
Calhoun blinked, but didn't question the request.
"Odd-looking fellow he was, and I don't mean just the way he was dressed. It was as if the two sides of his face didn't belong together. One eye was even a different colour than the other. But it was actually his boots that made me notice him at first. His clothes were those of a common workman, but he had a pair of fine new boots that would be the envy of many a Bond Street beau." "When was this?"
"Monday, my lord."
"Monday?"
Neither Sebastian nor Hero had seen Diggory Flynn before Tuesday.
"You're certain?"
"Yes, my lord. I noticed him as I was returning from Hobbs. I remember because I'd been telling him how pleased we were with your new beaver hat."
A pained expression shadowed the valet's even features.
"The same hat someone put a bullet hole through that very night."
"What was the man doing when you saw him?"
"Simply leaning against the corner, but he looked so out of place that I paused to ask if there was something he needed. And he said no, and he pushed away from the wall and walked off, whistling."
"If you see him again, let me know about it. But be careful with him. I think there may well be more to the man than meets the eye."
"Yes, my lord."
Calhoun gave a neat bow and started to turn away, then paused.
"Are you still interested in Captain Wyeth, my lord?"
"I am indeed. Did you have any success at the Shepherd's Rest?"
"Far more than I should have, actually. The staff there are appallingly eager to chat about the inn's residents."
"What do they say about Captain Wyeth?"
"The general consensus is that he's a likeable enough fellow most of the time, although he does have a tendency to be moody and curt when his wounds are paining him, and he has a bit of a temper, it seems."
"Oh?"
"Last Saturday evening the captain was having a pint down in the public room when Stanley Preston came charging in and threatened to horsewhip him."
"Yes, Wyeth told me of the incident."
"Did he also tell you he threatened to kill the man?"
"Wyeth threatened to kill Stanley Preston?"
"That's right. I thought at first the barman who told me the tale might be exaggerating a touch, but two of the other lads backed him up."
"What was Preston's reaction?"
"I gather he simply said,
'You don't scare me,' and left."
Sebastian glanced at the clock.
"I think perhaps I need to have another chat with our gallant captain."
Sebastian found Captain Hugh Wyeth standing beside the ring of the lifeguards' riding school, his arms looped over the top rail of the fence, and his gaze following a half-dozen new recruits being put through their paces. The air was thick with the smell of saddle leather and horse sweat, and a fine dust that shimmered in the spring sunshine.
"So, what do you think?"
asked Sebastian, coming to stand beside him, his gaze on the horses and riders in the ring before them.
"They're green, but they're willing and able. They'll get there."
He glanced over at Sebastian.
"Ever miss the army?"
"Sometimes."
"Why'd you sell out?" "Because I realized I wasn't fighting on the side of good against evil," thought Sebastian, still watching the men in the ring.
because my own colonel sent me off with falsified dispatches and then betrayed me to the French, because I trusted the wrong people and dozens of innocent women and children died as a result. But all he said was, I grew tired of killing men who were much like me, except they spoke a different language and owed allegiance to a different country. Wyeth was silent for a moment, his hands tightening over the top rail, the smile lines fanning his eyes etched deep, although he was not smiling.
Those are not comfortable thoughts.
No. The captain narrowed his gaze against the dust.
Why are you here?
I'm wondering why you didn't tell me that when Stanley Preston threatened to take a horsewhip to you, you swore you'd kill him. Wyeth blew out a long, painful breath. Sebastian said, It did happen, didn't it? The captain nodded, his lips pressed into a tight line. Then he threw Sebastian an assessing sideways glance. You're trying to convince me you've never threatened to kill anyone? It's a kind of thing a man says in anger. I could kill you, or even, I swear to God I'll kill you. Sebastian thought about the number of times he'd sworn to kill his own father-in-law, but remained silent. Wyeth said, I won't deny I wanted to kill the bastard, but I couldn't have done it, even if he had tried to take a horsewhip to me. Don't you understand? He was Anne's father. She loved him, and his death has devastated her. I could never have done that to her. Sebastian studied the younger man's handsome, earnest face. It was hard not to like Captain Wyeth, but Sebastian had known other handsome, seemingly charming men who were extraordinarily adept at projecting an intense impression of affability and sincerity, when the reality was something quite different entirely. "Tell me again what happened last Sunday night," he said. Wyeth shrugged. "There's not much to tell. Anne wangled an invitation for me to Lady Farningham's musical evening, but she had a Miss Austen there with her, and we found it impossible to have any real private conversation together. So, in the end, I left." "You're saying Miss Preston spent Sunday evening in the company of Jane Austen?" "That's right. Why?" Sebastian shook his head. "I hadn't realized it. Go on." "That's it, really. I left around 10. Only I wasn't in the mood to come back to the inn and drink with the lads, so I went for a walk." "Where?" "Along Knightsbridge, mainly. I was just walking. See anyone?" "No one I knew." "What about when you returned to the inn? Did anyone see you then?" "No, I told you." "I wasn't in the mood to be sociable. I went straight up to my room." "Why?" Sebastian had asked the question because whoever killed Stanley Preston would surely have been splattered with blood. But all he said was, "Ever meet an elderly physician named Douglas Sterling?" "The one who was found dead yesterday?" Wyeth shook his head. "No." He stared off beyond the barracks toward the park. "I've had the constables here again, questioning me. They think I did it, don't they?" "I'm afraid so. You've a powerful motive, no alibi, and considerable practice lopping off people's heads." Wyeth gave a soft, rueful laugh. "They think I'm some sort of fortune hunter, like that fellow Wickham, or Willoughby." The names sounded vaguely familiar, but Sebastian couldn't place them. "Who?" "From Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice." "Don't tell me you read romance novels, too." Wyeth laughed. "Only the ones Miss Austen writes. They're very clever, especially this last one." Sebastian stared at him. "Jane Austen is the author of this new book that's taking the ton by storm?" Wyeth pulled a face. "I forgot I wasn't supposed to say anything. You won't tell anyone, will you?" Returning to Brook Street, Sebastian found Hero writing up her interview notes at the library table, their infant son dozing contentedly in a basket beside her, and the black cat she named Mr. Darcy lying stretched out like a dog nearby. "How was your interview?" he asked, going to pour himself a glass of wine. "Informative. This fellow has a donkey cart which places him amongst the most prosperous of all costermongers." She laid aside her quill and leaned back in her chair. "Care to tell me why you saw the need to send a footman to the park with Claire and Simon this morning?" Sebastian came to stand beside the fire, his gaze on his sleeping son's peaceful, innocent face. "A man who sounds like Diggory Flynn has been seen watching the house. I don't know who he is or what he wants, but I feel better if you and Simon both kept someone with you." Hero stared at him for a long, quiet moment. "What makes you think he's a threat to us?" "Not you, but us." Sebastian took a slow sip of his wine. "I keep thinking about the tale Jamie Knox told me, about the smuggler who ran afoul of Pris Mulligan and came home one day to find his wife missing and the dismembered bodies of his children strategically displayed around the house." "So you're back to thinking Flynn works for Pris Mulligan?" "I don't know for certain who he works for, but I don't want to take any chances." Beside them, Simon stretched and let out a soft gurgle. Hero stared at Sebastian for a long, quiet moment, then went to lift the child from his basket and hold him in her arms, the blue wool skirts of her walking dress swirling about her ankles as she swung him gently from side to side and said, "Well, good afternoon, young man." Simon cooed and laughed in response, and for one long moment Sebastian lost himself in looking at them. Then he said, "Tell me about this character in Pride and Prejudice. I think his name is Wickham." She glanced over at him with a soft, startled laugh. "George Wickham? Whatever for?" "Because everyone seems to keep referencing him, and I've just discovered Miss Jane Austen is the book's author." "You can't be serious. Who told you that?" "Captain Wyeth. Ordinarily, I'd be inclined to question his reliability, but it makes sense of something Henry Austen said to me the other day." Hero brought Simon up so she could rub noses with him, her gaze on the laughing child. "George Wickham is an officer in the militia who is stationed near the Bennets. They're the family at the centre of the story. At first he's portrayed as handsome and charming and excellent in every way, except, of course, for his sad lack of fortune. But the reader gradually begins to realize that he is, in truth, a cunning and unscrupulous liar, who uses others for his own ends without conscience or regret." Simon gurgled happily, and she shifted the child's weight, his eyes big and wide and golden as he grinned at Sebastian over her shoulder. "You think Captain Wyeth could be another George Wickham?" "I'm told Jane Austen fears he might be." "So, who is Willoughby?" "I suppose you could call him the villain of Sense and Sensibility. Or one of them, at any rate. Like Wickham, he is charming, handsome, and impoverished, as well as being deceptive and breathtakingly selfish, although I don't think Willoughby is quite as conscienceless or calculating as Wickham. Needless to say, neither comparison reflects well on Captain Wyeth." "No, which makes me wonder why he mentioned them." Wide awake now, Simon reached out to close his tiny fist around the thick silver chain at Hero's neck and pulled hard. "Ouch!" she said, laughing as she tried without success to loosen his hold on the necklace. "Your son has a shockingly strong grip." Sebastian set aside his wine. "Here, let me help." It wasn't until he came closer that he got his first good look at the intricately worked chain and the pendant that nestled at the base of her throat. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice sounding odd even to his own ears. "My father gave it to me some time ago." "Why?" Sebastian carefully loosed his son's hold on the centuries-old necklace.
"I've never seen you wear it."
"The catch was faulty. I only recently had it mended." The frown lines were back between her brows. "Is something wrong?"
"No, of course not."
He reached out hesitantly to touch his fingertips to the smooth bluestone disc with a closed silver triskelion set against it. And for one heart-wrenching moment he imagined he could feel the familiar pulse of its legendary, inexplicable power. She said, "Have you spoken to Miss Jane Austen about any of this?"
"What? Oh, no."
He dropped his hand and turned away to retrieve his glass. "Would you like me to talk to her? After all, I had read the books."
"It might be better."
She tilted her head to one side, as if both puzzled and concerned by something she saw. "Sebastian, are you all right?"
"Yes, of course,"
he said, and drained the rest of his wine in one long, burning pull. Chapter 36. Miss Jane Austen was in the elegant parterre garden at the rear of her brother's house, deep in earnest consultation with an aged, gnarled gardener, who was gesturing wildly with his hands when Hero arrived at Sloane Street. "I'm interrupting you," said Hero, when a flustered young housemaid showed her to the terrace. "I do beg your pardon." "No, please," said Miss Austen, hurrying forward to offer Hero a seat at a wrought-iron table, positioned to catch the warmth of the rare spring sunshine. She wore a faded bonnet and a plain, old-fashioned gown, had a faint smudge of dirt across one red cheek, and was utterly unruffled. "Jenkins simply wanted my approval of some new plantings for the parterres. The garden is my cousin Eliza's design, you know. She spent many happy years in France before the Revolution, and I think it reminds her of those days." "It is lovely," said Hero, unfurling her parasol against the sun's rays. "How does your cousin?" "Not well, I fear." Jane Austen's dark eyes, pinched with a deep, quiet sorrow, kept carefully tucked away. "I'm sorry." Her hostess nodded, her face held tight against a threatened upsurge of emotions. "She's lived a marvellously adventurous life, you know, born in India, then living through the Revolution. She's always been so vibrant, so full of life. To see her like this is painful." "It must be very difficult for your brother." "It is, yes. He has loved her almost his entire life." She carefully smoothed the skirt of her faded gown. "Please tell me you aren't here because Lord Devlin still thinks Henry had something to do with Stanley Preston's death." The truth was, Devlin hadn't ruled out anyone at this stage, but Hero simply adjusted the tilt of her parasol and said, "Actually, Devlin is interested in certain aspects of your novels." Miss Austen's naturally ruddy cheeks darkened ever so slightly. "Who told you? My brother?" "Indirectly, along with Captain Wyeth." "Ah." She paused while the young housemaid reappeared, bearing a hastily assembled tea-tray, the delicate rose-strewn china cups and plates clattering as the girl dumped the tray on the table. "Throughout history we women have been endlessly scorned for our supposed readiness to reveal things which ought by rights to remain private. Yet I find that in practice men are equally, if not more, inclined to indiscretion." Hero laughed. "I suspect you are right. Although the truth is, your novels have excited so much interest in fashionable circles that I doubt you'll be able to remain anonymous much longer." It was a thought that did not appear to trouble the author overly much, and Hero suspected the choice to publish anonymously had been prompted less by a desire to remain unknown than by the realization that society would condemn any spinster vicar's daughter who appeared to be chasing fame and recognition. Miss Austen eased the cover from the teapot and began to pour. "Surely Lord Devlin can't think my novels have anything to do with this murder?" "No, of course not. But your brother says you think Captain Wyeth might be another Wickham or Willoughby, and I assume it isn't simply because the three men's names all begin with the same consonant." Miss Austen kept her attention on the task of pouring the tea. "It would be more accurate to say I worry that he might be. Have you met him?" "No." "He comes across as an agreeable, sensible man with good understanding and a warm heart, a man of strength and principle." "But," prompted Hero. Miss Austen looked up from the tea. "Who can answer for the true sentiments of a clever man?" "Is he clever?" "Very." Hero took the teacup handed her. "Has he given you reason to suspect his sincerity?" "Truthfully? No." Miss Austen took a sip of her own tea and stared out over the sun-warmed French-style garden. "Eliza, my cousin, believes that Anne's love has proven itself so enduring that she ought to be allowed to marry her captain, although of course she worries what sort of future lies ahead for them. We've all known young women who married poor men for love, only to live a life of regret. Poverty can be so terribly grinding." Hero studied her hostess's even, carefully composed features and found herself wondering about this woman's own romantic past. How much of the author's own life experiences, Hero wondered, had made their way into her books. "Yet she won't be poor," said Hero, choosing her words carefully. "Stanley Preston's death means that Anne is now free to marry her impoverished young captain and keep her inheritance from her father." Miss Austen raised her gaze to Hero's face. "I may have questioned Captain Wyeth's sincerity, but I never would have believed him capable of murder, especially one of such savagery. He spent the last 6 years at war. That sort of experience can brutalize some men." "Most men, I should think," said Miss Austen quietly. Hero took a sip of her tea and shifted her gaze to where the old gardener Jenkins was forking over the earth of one of the parterres. "I understand Miss Preston attended Lady Farningham's musical evening in your company." "She did, yes. My cousin had hoped to be able to go with her, but I'm afraid Eliza rarely leaves her room these days." "Did you know Captain Wyeth would be there?" Miss Austen expelled her breath in a kind of sigh. "No, although I realize in retrospect that Anne obviously knew it. No simple musical evening could have inspired the level of excitement and anticipation she displayed. Unfortunately, she and the captain had words during the break, and he left almost immediately afterward." "They quarrelled?" "Yes, although I couldn't tell you the reason for the disagreement. Anne refused to discuss it, and I had no desire to press her. We ourselves left not long afterward. She pled a sick headache and wanted to go home." "So she was home before 10. A good half-hour before her father's murder," thought Hero, although she didn't say it. "Yes." "Interesting. I don't believe that was made clear to anyone." A vaguely troubled look came over Miss Austen's features, but she simply picked up the plate of biscuits from the tray and held it out to Hero. "Please, have some." "Thank you." "That's an interesting necklace you're wearing," said Miss Austen, adroitly shifting to a safer topic of conversation as she set the plate between them. "It looks quite ancient." Hero touched her fingertips to the blue stone and silver triskelion at her neck. "I believe it is, yes. Although I must confess, I don't know its history. I saw something quite like it once, while visiting friends near Ludlow. We were invited to dine one evening at Northcote Abbey, and Lady Seton showed us the portrait gallery. There was a painting of a woman wearing an almost identical piece. I remember it, because the family legend attached to it caught my imagination. According to the story, the necklace had the power to choose its next owner by growing warm to that person's touch. It seems Lord Seton's great-great-grandmother was a natural daughter of James II, and the necklace was his gift to her on her wedding day." Hero was suddenly intensely conscious of the pendant lying warm against the flesh of her throat, and of the inscribed initials entwined on its back. A.C. and J.S. "There was some tragedy involved," Miss Austen was saying, "although I must confess I don't recall all the details. I believe she married a Scottish lord who treated her abysmally after her father, the king, lost his throne. In fiction, we can mould reality to our will and make all rich men as worthy and handsome as anyone could wish. But life is unfortunately far less tidy. Wealthy men are often silly, insufferable bores, or worse, while far too many handsome men with good hearts have everything to recommend them except a comfortable independence. So is Captain Wyeth a particularly vicious version of George Wickham, or a sadly impoverished Mr. Darcy? Miss Austen's worried gaze met Hero's. I wish I knew. Hero was perched halfway up the library ladder, a copy of Debrett's Peerage open in her hands, when Devlin walked into the room.
"What are you doing?"
he asked. Trying to find the name of the Scottish lord who married one of James II's natural daughters, said Hero, still flipping through the pages.
Why?
I saw Miss Austen this afternoon. And? You were right. She does indeed worry that Captain Wyeth might not be as amiable or open-hearted as he takes pains to appear. She also tells me that Anne and her captain quarrelled halfway through Lady Farningham's musical evening, at which point Anne pled a sick headache and went home. Before 10. She looked up then to find him frowning. He said,
I don't like the sound of that.
No, I didn't think you would. He nodded to the book in her hands.
What does James II's natural daughter have to do with anything?
She doesn't, but Miss Austen was intrigued by my necklace. She said it reminded her of a piece she'd once seen in a portrait of a woman reputed to be the daughter of James Stuart by one of his mistresses, which is fascinating, because on the back of this necklace are two sets of entwined initials,
AC and JS.
Hero stared at him. How did you know? He turned away and went to where the brandy stood warming by the fire. She could see the rigid set to his shoulders, hear the tension in his voice.
The necklace once belonged to my mother, he said, easing the stopper from the decanter. She was wearing it when she was lost at sea the summer I was 11.
Hero felt a yawning ache open up inside her, the ache she always felt when she thought of the losses suffered by the boy he'd once been. In one hot, unforgettable summer, he had lost both his older brother Cecil and his mother. There was a portrait of Sophia, the Countess of Hendon, that hung over the fireplace in the drawing-room, and Hero often found herself studying it. The Countess had been a beautiful woman, her hair the colour of gold guineas, her features exquisitely moulded, her eyes clear and sparkling with intelligence and humour, and a wild kind of thirst, as if she yearned for something missing in her life. And then, one sunny August day, she'd sailed away from Brighton on a friend's yacht for what was supposed to be a few hours' pleasure cruise, and she'd never returned. Lost at sea, they told the world, told Sebastian, even though he refused to believe it. Day after day he stood on the cliffs, looking out to sea, waiting for her to return, convinced that she couldn't be dead, convinced that if she were dead, he'd know it, feel it. In time he had come to accept that they told the truth, only to learn as a man grown that it was all lies. She had simply left the Earl, the man he had falsely believed to be his father. Left him. Sebastian had shared with Hero many of his darkest, most painful secrets, but the truth about his mother, that she still lived, Hero had learned only from Jarvis, and she had never told Devlin what she knew. Now she watched him splash brandy into his glass and said softly, "Except that she wasn't really lost at sea, was she, Devlin?" He looked at her over his shoulder, the decanter held forgotten in his hand, his face a mask of control.
Jarvis told you?
Yes.
Did he also tell you that she ran off to Venice with her latest lover, a handsome young poet, a good 10 years her junior?
No. Hero set aside the book and stepped off the ladder, her gaze never leaving his face. "How did my father come to have the necklace?"
"It reappeared 2 years ago, around the neck of Guinevere Anglesea's dead body."
"But—"
She shook her head, not understanding. He'd solved Guinevere's murder as he had solved so many, but that had been before Hero's life became inextricably merged with his. Where did she get it? "It seems my mother gave it to her years ago, when they met briefly in the south of France after the Peace of Amiens. Guinevere was still a child at the time, while my mother—"
He replaced the stopper in the decanter and set it aside.
"My mother was the mistress of a French general."
Hero studied his tightly held face. "Do you know where she is now? Lady Hendon, I mean." He shook his head.
"I've hired men to look for her, but the war does rather complicate things."
"Why?" Hero wanted to ask. "Why are you so desperate to find the mother who sailed off and left you when you were so young? Left you with a man she knew was not your father?" But she realized she knew the answer. He searched for the beautiful, laughing Countess because he still loved her, despite the hurt and anger and sting of betrayal, and because he wanted to ask her which of her many unnamed lovers had fathered the man now known to the world as Viscount Devlin. "I still don't understand how Jarvis came to have the necklace," said Hero.
"I gave it to him. I had no desire to see it again."
Reaching up, she loosed the necklace's clasp and held it out to him. "I'm sorry I wore it. I didn't know." He made no move to take it from her.
"The portrait Jane Austen told you about, did she mention where she'd seen it?"
"A place called Northcote Abbey, near Ludlow."
"Ludlow?"
"Yes." "Why?" she asked. And then, as soon as she said it, she realized why. Jamie Knox, the Bishopsgate tavern keeper who looked enough like Devlin to be his brother, was from Ludlow. Devlin simply shook his head, obviously unwilling to put his thoughts into words. But when she laid the necklace on the table beside him, he picked it up. Chapter 37. Jamie Knox was stripped down to his shirt-sleeves and chopping kindling in the ancient courtyard at the rear of the Black Devil when Sebastian walked up to him. He glanced over at Sebastian, but kept at his task, the muscles in his back bunching and flexing beneath the linen of his shirt as he swung the axe.
"Still looking for your murderer, are you?"
"Yes, but that's not why I'm here."
"Oh?"
Sebastian held up the silver and blue stone necklace so that the pendant dangled from its chain.
"Have you ever seen this before?"
Knox paused to swipe one forearm across his sweaty forehead, then reached out and cupped the pendant in his left palm, his yellow eyes narrowing.
"Not to my knowledge."
"Why?" "I'm told it can be seen in a 17th-century painting that hangs in the portrait gallery of Northcote Abbey, near Ludlow." Knox gave a soft grunt.
"And you're thinking that because I'm from Shropshire, I might have seen this painting? It's a grand place, Northcote Abbey. Last I heard, Lord and Lady Seaton were more than a bit choosy about who they invited inside. Or do you suspect me of having prigged the bauble at some point in my long and varied career? Actually, it once belonged to my mother. An old Welshwoman gave it to her before I was born."
Knox reached for a pitcher of ale that rested atop a nearby stretch of stone wall and drank heavily. Then he stood for a moment with his hands on his hips, his breath coming heavy from his labours, his gaze thoughtful on Sebastian's face.
"You ever been to Shropshire?"
Sebastian shook his head.
"Not since I was quite young." "You have people there?"
"Not to my knowledge." A breeze gusted up, filled with the rattle of dead leaves across the ancient paving and the whisper of unanswered questions that had never been asked. Knox wiped his sleeve across his forehead again.
"When I was 16, I couldn't get away from there fast enough. took the king's shilling and marched off to see the world, convinced I'd never want to go back. But lately I find myself thinking Shropshire wouldn't be such a bad place to raise a family.
You could still go back? They have pubs in Shropshire.
Knox's teeth flashed in a smile as he hefted his axe.
So they do.
Once the tavern-keeper had told Sebastian that his mother was a young barmaid who'd named 3 men as the possible father of her child: a gypsy stable-hand, an English lord, and a Welsh cavalry officer. But she died before she was able to tell anyone which of the 3 the boy resembled. For Sebastian, the desire to know the truth about the mysterious man who may have sired them both, the truth about the shared blood that in all likelihood flowed through their veins, was like an open, festering wound. As a boy, he'd grown up with 2 brothers, or rather 2 half-brothers, sons of the Earl of Hendon and his unfaithful countess. Both were long dead. Now Sebastian looked at Jamie Knox and wondered if he were looking at another brother, a 3rd half-brother he had never known he had. It was, Sebastian knew, the real reason he kept coming back here. The real reason the 2 men kept circling around each other. For he didn't need to be told to know that Jamie Knox was as puzzled and intrigued as he.
"I heard an interesting tale last night,"
said Knox, as he turned back to his work, his axe-blade biting deep into a new length of wood. Sebastian watched him free the axe and swing again.
"Oh, what's that?" "Seems a month or so ago, your Stanley Preston bought a medieval reliquary from Pris Mulligan. Paid a pretty penny for it, he did, only to discover just last week that it's a fake, and that Pris knew it all along. So what did he do? Went charging over to Houndsditch and demanded his money back. Even threatened to expose Pris to the authorities."
"When was this?"
"Last Saturday."
"The day before he was killed?"
"That's right. How reliable is your source?"
Knox paused to look at Sebastian over one shoulder, his lean face slick with sweat, his expression unreadable.
"Very."
"And how did Pris Mulligan respond to Preston's threat?"
"She swore that if he so much as thought about going to the authorities, she'd send her lads to strangle Preston with his own intestines, and feed what was left of him to the dogs."
"Colourful," said Sebastian. Knox sank his axe-head deep into the chopping block and straightened.
"She is that, and more."
Pris Mulligan was winding the key of a mechanical nightingale when Sebastian pushed open the battered door and walked into her shop. Despite the brightness of the afternoon, the interior was gloomy, the small panes of the front windows thick with the accumulating grime, cobwebs, and entombed dead insects of centuries. Rather than look up, Pris simply kept winding the gilded, jewel-encrusted trinket, and he realized she must keep lookouts posted on the street outside, because she'd obviously known he was coming.
"Back again, are you?"
she said, setting the trinket on the counter between them. The nightingale began to sing melodiously, its delicate gilded wings beating slowly up and down, its tiny beak opening and closing, the jewelled collar around its neck glittering with simulated fire.
"Interesting,"
said Sebastian, watching it.
"Ain't it just? And the jewels are real rubies and sapphires, too. No paste."
"Of course they are," said Sebastian. Rather than take offence, she laughed out loud, her small, beady eyes practically disappearing into her fat face. He nodded to the mechanical bird between them.
"Where does it come from?"
"Persia.
Or maybe China. Does it matter? Sings as sweet and sunny as an angel of the good Lord, it does."
The clear notes began to slow down, the key cleverly concealed in the bird's tail feathers turning slower and slower, the wings seeming to grow heavier and heavier with each flutter. He said, "I've discovered you've been less than honest with me." She gave him a look of shocked innocence.
You don't say.
Last Saturday, Stanley Preston came charging into your shop and accused you of cheating him. He threatened to turn you into the authorities as a fence, whereupon you threatened to strangle him with his own intestines and feed what was left of him to the dogs.
Nah, that weren't it. Dunno who you been talking to, but I said I was going to strangle him with his own guts and feed his privates to the dogs.
Sebastian studied her broad, still smiling face.
Yet you told me you hadn't seen the man in a month or more.
She shrugged.
Reckon I forgot.
You forgot?
Got a terrible memory, I do.
You do realize, of course, that his threat to turn you over to the authorities gives you a powerful motive for murder.
It might, if I thought he meant it. Only he didn't.
So certain?
Course I'm certain. Everybody cheats each other in this business, when they can, and the buyers is as guilty as the sellers. You such a flat as to think Preston cared whether the stuff he bought here was stolen or not? He couldn't expose me without exposing himself now, could he?
He could claim not to know the origins of your merchandise.
To be sure he could. But then, so could I now, couldn't I?
She poked one short fat finger toward him.
If he'd been strung up by his own innards and gelded, you might be able to pin this one on me. But he weren't, so get out of me shop.
Sebastian nodded to the now silent bird on the counter between them.
How much is the nightingale?
She snatched it up and cradled it against her massive bosom as if it was something rare and precious to her.
Time for sale. Not to you.
Sebastian kept his gaze on her face.
Ever have dealings with anyone from Windsor Castle?
Her unexpected, slow smile betrayed not a hint of either recognition or alarm.
I told you, I only deal in human heads if they're gilded and studded with jewels.
I don't recall saying anything about a head, said Sebastian, and walked out of her shop. The sun was sinking low in the sky when Sebastian joined Gibson for a pint at an ancient half-timbered tavern near the tower. The Irishman's eyes were hollow and bruised-looking, and there was a decidedly green tinge to his face.
"You think it was a trap?"
said Gibson, wrapping his unsteady hands around his tankard.
"That Pris Mulligan used the king's head as bait to lure Preston to Bloody Bridge and then kill him?"
Sebastian leaned his shoulders against the worn high back of the old-fashioned settle.
"I think it's a strong possibility, yes."
Gibson drained the rest of his ale and set aside the empty tankard.
"How do you know your unknown thief himself isn't the killer? Maybe he decided to kill Preston, steal whatever money he'd brought, and then sell the head to Pris Mulligan."
"That's also a possibility."
"But you don't think so?"
"Why would a simple thief go to all the trouble of cutting off Preston's head and setting it up on the bridge?"
"Why would anyone who wasn't more than a wee bit crazy?"
"True."
Sebastian signalled the barmaid for 2 more pints.
There is a third possibility."
"There is?"
"Preston could have been at the bridge to meet whoever stole the royal relics. Only someone else followed him to the bridge and killed him. Someone like Wyeth or Oliphant, or even Henry Austen. After all, we only have his word as to the nature of their quarrel."
Gibson grunted.
"What I don't understand is how this old physician, Sterling, fits into anything. Why kill him?"
"My guess is he figured out who killed Preston, or at least had a pretty good idea."
Sebastian frowned.
"Although there could always be another link that I'm missing entirely."
Gibson swiped his shaky hand down over his pale, clammy face.
"Alexis says she gave you the results of Sterling's autopsy."
"She did, yes."
Sebastian studied his friend's heavy-lidded, bloodshot eyes.
"Did you ever get a chance to look at the body yourself?"
Gibson shook his head, his gaze sliding away.
"How's your leg now?" Sebastian asked gently.
"Better."
Sebastian remained silent, but Gibson seemed to know the direction of his thoughts, for he said, "It's barmy, if you ask me. Thinking you can get rid of the phantom pains from a man's missing leg with nothing more than a box and mirrors. We don't understand much about the mind or how it functions, do we? Madame Sauvage seems to think it could work. So why not try it? What have you got to lose? Besides your pain and an opium addiction that's going to kill you," Sebastian thought, although he didn't say it. Gibson set his jaw and shook his head, and Sebastian knew his refusal was all tied up with his pride, and a fear of looking foolish or weak, and a host of other emotions Sebastian couldn't even guess at, and suspected Gibson himself had no desire to probe. The surgeon waited while the buxom young barmaid set 2 new tankards on the table, then said, "So where's this king's head now, do you think?" "I suppose that depends on whether the thief and the killer are the same person. But if the thief isn't the killer, then I'm afraid he's probably in danger, and I suspect he knows it." Gibson stared at him. "How do you figure that?" "One of 2 things. Either the killer used the king's head to lure Preston to Bloody Bridge, in which case the thief knows who the killer is, or the thief had nothing to do with the murder, but arrived at the bridge in time to see something." "What makes you think he saw something?" "Because someone, either the thief, the killer, or Preston himself, dropped that inscribed lead strap beside the stream. And if it was the thief, then he must have been too rattled, or afraid of being seen, to take the time to look for it in the dark. Otherwise, why leave something that valuable? Especially something that has the potential to tie him to murder." Gibson leaned forward. "Maybe that's why Sterling was killed. He was a physician, after all. Most of them are more interested in drinking urine and dispensing potions than in studying anatomy, but some do. Could be he had ties to the resurrection men working out at Windsor, and figured out who your thief was." Sebastian paused with his tankard lifted halfway to his mouth. "Do you know any of them?" Gibson shook his head. "Resurrection men are fiercely territorial, and the lads I deal with tend to stick to the churchyards of the city or Mayfair. But I bet that verger you talked to could give you their names. He might not have ever managed to catch them red-handed, but he knows who they are. You can count on that. Actually, he was at pains to convince me that virtually anyone in Windsor could have accessed the crypt. Something I suspect the Dean would be shocked to hear." Gibson grunted. "Sounds like he probably deals with them himself. God knows he wouldn't be the first." Sebastian tried to picture Toothy Rowan Toop surreptitiously leaving greased gates unlocked in anticipation of the stealthy midnight visits of body snatchers, or offering to sell choice items lifted from the crypts under his care. And Sebastian found he had no difficulty imagining either scenario. Chapter 38. Sunday, 28th of March. The next morning Sebastian drove out to Windsor Castle to find the Right Reverend Edward Legg pacing back and forth before the chapel steps, his full cheeks flushed with annoyance. The morning had dawned cool and damp, with a fine mist that drifted across the lower court and hung in the half-dead trees near the cloisters. "I don't know where the fool has taken himself off to," snapped the Dean when Sebastian introduced himself and asked for the verger. "He wasn't here for morning services, and I'm to meet with the canons in less than 10 minutes. He's supposed to be there. The interment of Princess Augusta is this Wednesday." Sebastian studied the Dean's plump, self-absorbed face. "Have you sent to make inquiries at his lodgings?" "Of course I've sent to make inquiries," said the Dean. "What sort of imbecile do you take me for? His wife claims he went for a walk and never came back. When? How on earth would I know?" Sebastian shifted his gaze to a castle guard who was trotting across the court toward them. The Dean turned, following Sebastian's gaze. The guard was young and fresh-faced and breathing heavily, and he had to pause to suck in a few gulps of air before saying with a gasp, "He's dead, Reverend." Legg stared at him. "Toop? Are you saying Toop is dead?" "Yes, sir, The young guard paused to swallow hard. "They found him down by Romney Island, in the river." "What did the fool do? Fall in and drown?" "I don't think so, sir. His head's all caved in." A long, narrow stretch of wooded land in the middle of the Thames, Romney Island lay just below the old wooden bridge that connected Windsor to the town of Eton, on the north bank of the river. That morning, a gap-toothed, tow-headed boy of 12 had rowed his skiff from Eton out to the island and was just dropping a fishing line into the water when he noticed the black cloth of the verger's cassock floating amidst the exposed roots of a willow at the river's edge. By the time Sebastian reached the island, a constable and the keeper from the nearby lock had already hauled the sodden body up onto the gravel bank. The verger lay on his stomach, his arms sprawled stiffly out from his sides, his head turned so that one glassy eye seemed to stare at Sebastian in startled horror as he hunkered down beside the body. From the looks of things, the man had probably been dead a good 8 to 10 hours, although Sebastian could never remember if cold water sped up or slowed down the processes of death. He looked up at the constable. "Do you know when he was last seen?" The constable, a brawny, middle-aged man with a heavy morning stubble of dark beard, wiped the back of one hand across his nose and sniffed. "His wife says he took the dog for a walk last night around 8:30. Gone a good while, he was, before she realised he hadn't come back. Had her sister visiting, and they was busy chatting, you see. Wasn't till the dog came barking at the door that she knew something was amiss." "How big is the dog?" The constable looked at Sebastian as if that were just the sort of daft question one might expect from some bloody London lord they'd been ordered to cooperate with. "Little grey thing about the size of a cat. Why?" If the constable couldn't fathom the significance of the size of the dog, Sebastian didn't have time to explain it to him. Then he realised the constable wasn't thinking in terms of murder. "The fog came up real bad just after dusk last night," said the constable. "Looks to me like the verger must have taken his dog for a walk along the river, slipped, hit his head on something, and fell in the river and drowned." "That's certainly one explanation," said Sebastian, studying the ugly gash on the side of the verger's head. The water had washed away all trace of blood, although the wound had undoubtedly bled profusely. He could see shattered bone amidst the pulpy flesh. If that's the case, it shouldn't be difficult to find the spot where he came to grief. His blood should be smeared all over whatever he hit. "I suppose so, my lord, but what difference does it make?" "I'm afraid there's a very good chance your verger had some help going into the river." The constable shook his head. "I don't understand. Help from who?" Sebastian pushed to his feet. "From whoever killed him." Sebastian's desire to have the dead verger sent to Paul Gibson for autopsy was met with predictable resistance from Dean Legg. "Send the body for a post-mortem," said the Dean with an indignant squeak, "all the way to London, when the fool simply tumbled into the river. What an unconscionable waste of funds." Sebastian kept his own voice calm and even. "I don't think we're dealing with an accident." "You can't be serious. Who would want to kill a simple verger? No, I can't authorize it. Even if a post-mortem were necessary, Windsor boasts any number of competent medical men who are more than capable of performing the task." Sebastian stared off across the misty court and uttered those magic words, "Jarvis," and "King Charles's head." The Dean closed his mouth, turned a sickly shade of grey, and bustled off to make the arrangements without further argument. The verger's lodgings lay to the west of the chapel in that part of the castle known as Horseshoe Cloister. A quaint old house of timber framing filled in with brick noggin, it dated back to the 15th century, with delicate window tracery, and a second story that jutted out over the ground floor. Sebastian found Rowan Toop's widow seated in a small but surprisingly fine parlour, and surrounded by a bevy of sombre-faced women who stared at him as if he were a crow who'd alit in the midst of a covey of mourning doves. He wouldn't have been surprised if the grieving widow had simply buried her face in the depths of her black linen handkerchief and used her grief as a reason not to speak with him. Instead, she excused herself to the ruffled ladies and withdrew with Sebastian through a low door into an adjoining dining room. "They mean well, I know," she said, closing the door to the parlour with a sigh of relief. "It's just that sometimes sympathy can be more oppressive than grief." It certainly appeared to be so in this case, Sebastian thought, studying her self-composed features and noticeably dry eyes. Either that, or the widow Toop was extraordinarily successful in hiding her feelings. She was a startlingly plain woman, built tall and as bony-thin as her late husband, but she was better born, and lost no time in letting Sebastian know she was the daughter of one of St. George's former canons. She was also, he suspected, better educated and more intelligent than Toop. Yet it was not at all difficult to understand how she had ended up married to a mere verger. Intelligent she might be, and gently bred, but she had a most unfortunate face, with a small squashed nose, and no chin, and bad teeth. She fixed Sebastian with a steady gaze. "You're here because of the death of my husband?"
"Yes, I'm sorry."
She nodded. "Rowan told me you'd been asking about the missing relics."
"Can you tell me if he stayed home last Sunday evening, or did he go out?"
The question didn't seem to surprise her, although he noticed her gaze slid away. "He was out, yes."
"Long enough to make it to London and back?"
She nodded quietly and went to fiddle with an expensive-looking silver épergne on the sideboard. Like the parlour, the dining room was small but exquisitely furnished, with a cabinet of fine French china and gilded sconces dripping cascades of faceted crystals. Some items were undoubtedly her own pieces, inherited from her mother, the canon's wife, but not all.
"Do you know where he went?" asked Sebastian. "Or why?"
"No."
Somehow Sebastian couldn't bring himself to come right out and ask this recently widowed woman if she'd known her husband was a grave robber. So he said instead, "Did your husband ever mention a woman named Pris Mulligan? She owns a second-hand shop in Houndsditch."
"I don't believe so, no. But then Rowan knew I had no interest in some of the things he did."
"That's one way to put it," Sebastian thought. Aloud he said, "How did he seem when he came home Sunday night?"
"Truthfully, I'd never seen him in such a state."
"In what sense?"
"It's almost as if he were frightened. Yes, that's it, frightened. Terrified, actually."
"Of what? Do you know?"
"No. I'm sorry. He said he didn't want to talk about it and went to bed."
"Was he carrying anything when he returned?"
"No." The question obviously puzzled her. "Whatever do you mean?" Sebastian simply shook his head.
"What about last night? Was he frightened when he took the dog for its walk?"
"I don't think so, no. They've been busy planning Princess Augusta's funeral, you know, and he always enjoyed royal affairs at the chapel."
"Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to harm your husband?"
Her eyes widened. "No, but I thought they said he simply fell into the river."
"Perhaps, perhaps not. Your husband never told you anything about what happened Sunday night? About who he was going to meet, or why?"
"No." Sebastian studied the widow's plain face, the delicate gold locket nestled at her throat, The fine muslin gown her husband had doubtless purchased with money gained from dealing with resurrection men or selling trinkets snatched from the dead. She was no fool. He had no doubt she had long ago guessed where the extra money came from to buy the fine china, the fashionable gowns, the expensive carpets on her floors. But she had simply accepted it all as her due, while remaining nominally ignorant of the activities that made it possible. And for the first time, Sebastian found himself almost feeling sorry for Toop, married to this plain, well-born, unhappy woman, who still felt nothing but contempt for him, no matter how hard he had tried to please her. He wondered why she had agreed to speak to him when she basically had nothing to tell him. Then he saw the spasm that passed over her features as her gaze wandered to the closed door to the parlour, and he thought he understood. The women who had come to comfort her, the wives and daughters of the canons of St. George's, still belonged to the world from which she had been demoted, and he had no doubt they were adept at subtly reminding her of her lowered station in life. He said, "Where will you go now?" This house would be given to the new verger of St. George's, whoever he might be. "My widowed sister has a cottage in Eton. I'll live with her." A small wire-haired grey dog came trotting in from the passage that led to the kitchen, and she bent to scoop it up into her arms. "Please accept my condolences," he said with a bow. "If you think of anything at all, that might help make sense of what happened to your husband, you will let me know." "Yes, of course," she said. But he knew she would not. What mattered to her was that Rowan Toop's death meant she was now utterly responsible for her own maintenance in a world that was not at all kind to plain, gently bred, impoverished women.